Hello everyone, I am the Creep's Cabin. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from? And what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. There is something about being deep in the wilderness that makes everything feel different. The air is heavier, thicker with the scent of pine and damp earth. The sounds carry in a way they don't back home, sharp, distinct, and sometimes unsettling. The feeling of being small, insignificant in a vast, untamed place never really leaves you out there. I was 14 when I learned that lesson the hard way. My dad and I had been backpacking in the Wanaha Wilderness in northeast Oregon, way out where the land folds into deep canyons and rugged hills. It was the kind of place where the maps didn't always match the land, where the trails wound endlessly through thick forest before suddenly breaking into wide, sweeping views of valleys and rivers below. We'd spent most of the day hiking down into the canyon, maybe 6 miles of switchbacks before we finally found a good spot to set up camp. The Wanaha River snaked through the valley below us, its water clear and cold, running over smooth, time-worn stones. We pitched our tent on a flat stretch of land not far from the water, beneath towering ponderosa pines that swayed gently in the breeze. The scent of sap hung heavy in the air, mingling with the distant smokiness of old campfires left behind by other hikers. The place felt untouched, like we were the only people who had ever been there. That evening, my dad caught a massive fish. I'd been casting my line, hoping for something decent, but he reeled in a monster. It flopped and thrashed, silver scales catching the last golden rays of sunlight before he finally got it under control. We cleaned it right there by the water, the cold biting at our fingers as we worked. The smell of fresh fish clung to our hands, even after we rinsed them in the river. By the time the sun dipped behind the canyon walls, our fire was crackling, and the fish was cooking, its skin crisping over the open flames. Darkness settled fast in the wilderness. One moment, the sky was streaked with deep orange and purple, and the next, we were enveloped in blackness. The only light came from our fire, flickering and dancing, casting long, shifting shadows around the campsite. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that makes your ears strain to pick up even the smallest noise. Every now and then, the wind rustled through the trees, sending needles drifting down like tiny spears onto our tent and the forest floor. An owl called from somewhere in the distance, its voice eerie in the night. I sat by the fire, poking at the embers with a stick, the warmth soothing against the evening chill. Then I heard it. A faint rustling sound came from the trees behind our camp. At first, I thought it was nothing, just a squirrel or some other small animal shifting around in the branches. But the more I listened, the more it seemed off. Too heavy for a squirrel, but not quite big enough to be something serious. Curious, and being the dumb teenager that I was, I picked up a few small rocks and started tossing them up into the branches. The first rock hit something solid. There was a scuffling sound, and whatever was up there moved higher, shifting its weight along the branch. It was bigger than I had expected. I figured it was a raccoon, maybe a couple of them, since I could still hear movement in the bushes below. I threw another rock, another scurry, more movement. The thing in the tree climbed even higher. I grinned to myself, feeling victorious. It was stupid looking back, but I didn't think much of it at the time. Just a dumb teenager throwing rocks at what I thought was a raccoon. Then I heard something on the ground. The rustling in the bushes near the base of the tree got louder, more deliberate. It wasn't the quick, darting movements of a raccoon anymore. It was heavier, slow, almost careful. My gut twisted, that strange instinctual warning setting off alarms in my brain. I grabbed my flashlight and flicked it on, swinging the beam up into the tree, expecting to see the little masked faces of raccoons staring back at me. But instead, I saw 2 black bear cubs. For a second, I didn't move. I just stood there, staring up at them, my brain trying to catch up with what I was looking at. They were clinging to the branches, small but unmistakably bears, their dark eyes reflecting the beam of my flashlight. They blinked, shifting slightly, gripping the bark with tiny claws. And then, just as the realization hit me, I remembered the movement in the bushes. Slowly, stiffly, I dropped the flashlight beam down, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst out of my chest. The light hit the ground, cutting through the darkness. And there she was. The mother bear stood maybe 15 feet away, just on the edge of the firelight. Her dark form was massive, solid muscle beneath thick fur. Her eyes caught the glow of the flashlight, burning like molten gold in the darkness. And then, as my light fully landed on her, she rose up on her hind legs. She was huge, towering, bigger than I ever could have imagined. And then she snapped her teeth. The sound was sharp, loud, like the crack of breaking bones. My breath caught in my throat. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my legs were locked in place. She snapped her jaws again, a warning, her head swaying slightly as she sized me up. The fire crackled between us, its heat licking at my back, but it felt like nothing compared to the raw terror washing over me. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over my own feet, but somehow managed to get my balance. My dad was beside me in an instant, both of us now standing on the far side of the fire, watching as the bear stood her ground. We didn't move. She didn't move. It was a standoff. Minutes stretched into eternity. My pulse was hammering in my ears, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The mother bear stayed where she was, her chest rising and falling in deep, steady breaths. Her cubs, still clinging to the branches, whimpered softly. And then, finally, after what felt like forever, she dropped back down onto all fours. She didn't charge, didn't lunge. Instead, she waited. Her ears twitched, her nose flaring as she took in our scent, and then, finally, she let out a low, rumbling huff. A sound of warning. A final statement. The cubs started climbing down. I could hear their claws scratching against the bark as they scrambled back to the ground. The mother bear waited, keeping her eyes locked on us, snapping her teeth one last time before she turned and disappeared into the trees, her cubs scurrying after her. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. My legs were trembling. My hands felt weak, useless. I could still hear the rustling of the underbrush as the bears moved further away, the sound growing fainter and fainter until finally, the night was silent again. For a long time, neither of us spoke. We just stood there, staring at the darkness where the bears had disappeared, the fire crackling between us. The smell of fish still lingered in the air. I don't know why she let us go. Maybe the fire had been enough to keep her cautious. Maybe we weren't worth the fight. Maybe she had just decided, in whatever way bears decide things, that we weren't a threat. We didn't sleep much that night. Every little noise had me snapping awake, heart hammering. The wilderness no longer felt peaceful. It felt alive, watching. By morning, the only sign the bears had ever been there were a few deep paw prints in the dirt near our camp. We packed up, put out the fire, and started the long hike back up the canyon. I've spent plenty of nights in the wild since then, but that night in the Wenaha wilderness, I'll never forget it. I was 10 years old the first time I truly felt fear. Not the kind of fear you get from scary movies or bad dreams, but the deep, real fear that comes when something is happening that you don't understand, when the world shifts just enough to make everything feel wrong. We were camping in Yosemite National Park, my family and I. My twin sister and I were excited for the trip. We had spent the day hiking, exploring, throwing rocks into the river, and looking up at the massive cliffs that surrounded the valley. The scale of everything made me feel small in a way I had never felt before. The trees were taller, the mountains stretched endlessly into the sky, and even the air felt different, crisper, colder. It smelled like pine, dirt, and campfire smoke. That night, the temperature dropped. My dad had warned us it would get cold, but I didn't expect it to be that cold. I huddled in my sleeping bag, listening to the distant sounds of other campers, low voices, the occasional laugh, the crackle of a dying fire. The sound of the Merced River rushing through the valley was always there, a constant hum in the background. The tent walls shifted slightly in the wind. At some point, my sister unzipped her sleeping bag and sat up. I could hear her rustling around, shivering as she slipped on her shoes. I barely paid attention until she whispered, "I have to pee." I didn't say anything. I just rolled onto my side, half awake. She unzipped the tent door, and the cold air rushed in like an open freezer. She hesitated for a moment, then stepped outside and zipped it shut behind her. I lay there, eyes half open, staring at the faint glow of the tent fabric. It was the only thing between me and the cold, dark woods beyond. I wasn't sure how much time passed. Maybe a minute, maybe 5. At first, I didn't think much of it, but as I lay there, listening to the outside world, something started to feel off. I couldn't hear her footsteps. The bathroom was close, maybe a minute's walk away at most, but she should have been coming back by now. A quiet unease started creeping in. I pulled the sleeping bag tighter around me. Then my parents stirred. My mom was the first to notice. I heard her sit up, whispering something to my dad. More rustling. Then the sound of the tent zipper again. I watched them step out, and suddenly I was alone. I didn't sit up right away. I just listened. At first, I could hear their footsteps crunching the dirt as they walked toward the bathroom. Then my mom called my sister's name. No answer. She called again. Louder. Then my dad joined in, his voice carrying further. Still nothing. The quiet unease inside me turned into something heavier. I could feel my heartbeat now. I wasn't scared of the dark, not really, but being alone in the tent with nothing but thin fabric separating me from the outside made me feel small and helpless. Then their voices started echoing. Yosemite Valley was massive, the granite walls rising so high that sound bounced off them in strange ways. My parents kept calling my sister's name, but the echoes made it hard to tell where their voices were actually coming from. It wasn't just a single echo either. Every call bounced around, repeating, stretching out into the distance. For a second, it almost felt like there were more voices than just theirs. I sat up, suddenly alert. The tent felt smaller, the walls closer. My fingers gripped the sleeping bag tightly. I couldn't hear my sister. Why didn't she just yell back? "I'm fine." That's all she had to say. Just 2 words, and this would all be over. But she didn't. I told myself it was probably nothing. Maybe she was embarrassed. Maybe she had already started walking back, but took the long way around. Maybe she had wandered a little too far, but would find her way back any second now. But what if she wasn't? What if something had happened? The idea hit me hard, and suddenly I felt very alone. I looked around the tent. It was just shadows, but everything seemed darker now. I reached for my hiking stick. It was one of those cheap wooden ones they sell at the visitor centers, smooth from being held so much. I clutched it tightly, my heart pounding. If something had taken her, it would come for me next. That was the thought that wouldn't leave my head. I tried to listen for anything, footsteps, voices, movement. But the only thing I heard was my parents' voices getting farther away. I sat there, frozen, for what felt like forever. The cold had seeped into my skin, but I didn't move. I just gripped the hiking stick, my mind racing. Then, finally, footsteps. Not my parents. These were faster, lighter. The tent unzipped. I tensed, gripping the stick harder. Then I saw the uniform. A park ranger. He looked at me, then glanced over his shoulder. Behind him, another ranger was walking beside my sister. Her head was down, her arms crossed over her chest like she was trying to make herself as small as possible. The tension inside me snapped. I let out a breath I didn't even realize I had been holding. My parents weren't far behind. My mom looked shaken. My dad's face was tight with worry. My sister still wouldn't look up. As it turned out, she had gone to the bathroom, but had accidentally walked out the wrong side. The layout of the campground had confused her in the dark, and instead of heading back to our tent, she had wandered further into the trees. She had gotten lost, and instead of calling for help, had stayed quiet, too embarrassed to yell. The rangers had found her wandering a few campsites away. I didn't say anything. I just sat there, still holding my hiking stick. That night, I didn't sleep well. Even after everything was fine, the feeling of being alone in the tent, gripping that stick, didn't leave me. The memory of my parents' voices echoing against the cliff stuck with me too. The way they had sounded so loud but also so far away at the same time. It wasn't until the next morning, when the sun rose and the warmth returned, that I finally started to feel normal again. But I never forgot that night. And even now, years later, when I think about it, I still wonder, just for a second, what if it hadn't been fine? I don't remember how old I was exactly. Maybe 6, maybe 7. I was young enough that I still wanted to be close to my mom when I got scared, but old enough that I wanted to pretend I wasn't scared in the first place. That didn't last long on this trip. We were camping, just like we always did. My family wasn't the kind that stayed in big RVs with a TV inside. We had tents, sleeping bags, and whatever we could fit in the trunk of the car. This time, we had picked a spot that felt more isolated than usual. No other campers nearby, just us trees and open land. The evening had been normal at first. We had a fire going, roasting marshmallows, watching the flames crackle. It was warm enough that the fire wasn't really needed, but sitting around one just felt right. The only strange thing about the night was the moon. It wasn't the usual pale white or soft yellow. It was a deep burnt orange, almost red, hanging low in the sky like something out of a bad dream. I remember staring at it, thinking it looked too big, too unnatural. It gave everything a strange, eerie glow, stretching our shadows long across the ground. The trees looked taller, the darkness thicker. I didn't say anything about it, though. Maybe because I thought my mom would tell me it was normal. Maybe because I didn't want to sound like a scared little kid. But I noticed that my mom wasn't really looking at the fire much. She kept glancing at the trees, her shoulders tight, eyes squinting into the dark like she was expecting something to step out of it. The first time we heard it, I thought I imagined it. A long, deep moaning sound, like something hurt, but far too big to be a person. It wasn't close, but it wasn't far enough away either. It carried across the open land, stretching out into the night. Then another, and another. Low, hollow moans that seemed to come from different directions, like whatever was making them was moving. Sometimes they stopped for a while, and I thought maybe it was over. Then another one would start again, closer than before. I wasn't the only one who noticed. My mom had stiffened, her hand tightening around her knee. The fire cracked, popping loudly, but it didn't drown out the next moan. This one was louder, longer. Coyotes started howling somewhere in the distance. I didn't know much about coyotes back then, just that they usually howled at night. But something about the way they sounded that night felt different. They weren't just howling. They were yipping, barking, their sounds sharp and nervous, like something had them on edge. My stomach felt weird, like when you know something bad is going to happen, but you don't know what. I didn't want to sit by the fire anymore. It felt too open, too exposed. When my mom said we should all go to bed, I didn't argue. We climbed into our tent, zipping it up tight, but it didn't feel like enough. A thin piece of fabric wasn't going to keep anything out. I curled up in my sleeping bag, staring at the top of the tent, trying to pretend I wasn't listening. But I was, and I wasn't the only one awake. My mom was lying still, but I could tell she wasn't sleeping. I could hear her breathing, slow and controlled. She was listening, just like me. Then, something moved outside. Not just twigs snapping or leaves rustling. This was heavier. Big, solid footsteps crunching against the dry grass, shifting the dirt. It wasn't fast. Whatever it was walking. Slowly. Then that awful moaning sound came again. It was close now, right outside the tent. I wanted to look. I wanted to unzip the flap just a little, just enough to see what was making that noise. But I couldn't move. I was frozen, gripping my sleeping bag so tight my fingers hurt. Another step. Another. Something brushed against the side of the tent. Not hard. Not like it was pushing against it, just barely enough that I knew it was there. The fabric shifted slightly, the noise sending a chill up my spine. The moaning was right outside. It wasn't human. It wasn't an animal I recognized. It was deep, broken, almost painful, like something old and dying, dragging itself through the dirt. It made the tent feel even smaller, like it could collapse in on us at any second. I couldn't take it anymore. I crawled across the tent as slowly as I could until I was right next to my mom. I pressed against her, waiting for her to say something, to tell me it was okay. But she didn't. She didn't move at all. And then, just when I thought it couldn't get worse, more footsteps joined in. There wasn't just one thing out there. There were several. I could hear them moving, circling, slow and heavy. Something snorted, exhaling loudly, followed by another long moan. I squeezed my eyes shut, too scared to even breathe. I don't remember when I finally fell asleep. Just that at some point, exhaustion won over fear. The next thing I knew, the sun was up. I could hear my family moving outside, talking casually like nothing had happened. Like we hadn't spent the night surrounded by those awful sounds. I sat up slowly, my body stiff from curling up so tight. My mom was already outside. I could hear her rummaging through the cooler, sorting through breakfast stuff. I crawled out of the tent, blinking against the bright morning light. And then I saw it. The ground was covered in tracks. Big, deep hoof prints pressed into the dirt, crisscrossing all around the campsite. Some were close to the tent, too close. And then I noticed the other thing. Cows hit. Everywhere. Piles of it scattered around the tents, near the fire pit, even close to where I had been sleeping. It didn't make sense. I had seen cows before. I had heard them before. They made normal cow noises, low, steady mooing, nothing like the sounds from last night. But those moans, those awful, hollow moans that had sent chills down my spine, that had kept me frozen in terror, unable to move or breathe. Those had been cows. I just stood there, staring at the mess, trying to make sense of it, trying to convince myself that I had been scared of something so harmless. But deep down, I wasn't convinced, because I knew what I had heard, and I never wanted to hear it again. I don't know how old I was. Somewhere between 6 and 8, maybe. The kind of age where everything still feels big, where shadows stretch longer, where your room at night feels like an entirely different place than it does in the daylight. I remember lying in bed, facing the wall, my blanket pulled up just below my chin. I always liked sleeping that way, on my side, turned away from the room. Maybe it was some leftover instinct from childhood, some part of my brain that thought, if I don't look at the room, nothing can get me. It was late. I know that much. The kind of late where the house settles into deep silence, where the faintest noises seem to stretch forever. I had just woken up from a bad dream. I don't remember all of it, just that it involved a werewolf. I had a ridiculous fear of them as a kid. I knew they weren't real, of course, but that never stopped me from feeling like they could be. The way they were always lurking in the dark corners of my mind, just waiting for me to be alone. I tried to settle back down, willing myself to focus on the familiar things in my room. The dim glow of my nightlight reflecting off the wall, the weight of my blanket, the slight chill of the air. I didn't want to think about the dream. I just wanted to go back to sleep. That's when I felt it. A touch. Not a hand, not fingers. Something else. It scraped against my back, slow and deliberate. A dull, metallic drag, like the curve of a spoon or a ladle tracing a path along my spine through the fabric of my pajama shirt. My whole body went rigid. I held my breath. My mind, still half tangled in the dream, screamed werewolf, but that didn't make sense. That didn't make sense at all. I tried to convince myself I had imagined it. Maybe my blanket had shifted. Maybe I had moved just enough to make it feel like something had touched me. Then it happened again. A tapping. Light, precise, pressing against my back in quick, calculated motions. Not random. Not like something brushing against me by accident. I couldn't move. I wanted to. Every nerve in my body told me to turn, to look, to do something. But I couldn't. I just lay there frozen, every muscle locked tight. I could hear the silence in the room pressing down around me, the faint hum of the house settling, the distant tick of the clock in the hallway. Nothing else. I told myself to count. Counting made time feel real. Counting made me feel like I had control over something. I counted each slow second in my head. 10, 20, 30, a minute, 2, 5. The tapping stopped. I still didn't move. My ears strained, trying to pick up any sound behind me. Nothing. Just the quiet, the heavy stillness of the room. My own breathing, shallow and careful. I don't know how long I stayed like that. 10 minutes? 15? It felt like an hour. Maybe longer. The kind of time that stretches endlessly when you're too scared to move. Then I turned. Slowly, carefully, barely breathing. I shifted just enough to glance over my shoulder. And I saw it. My wardrobe shook. Not a small shift. Not the way furniture settles when the house creaks. It shook. A sudden, violent jerk, as if something inside had slammed against it. The whole thing rattled for a second, then went still. My stomach clenched so hard I thought I would throw up. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't move for a long time. I just stared, waiting, my heartbeat hammering so loudly I thought it would shake the room itself. And then I screamed. I screamed for my parents, for anyone. I didn't stop. I kept screaming until I heard them rushing down the hall, their footsteps pounding against the floorboards. The door burst open. Light flooded in. I sat up so fast I got dizzy. My blanket pooled around my waist, my whole body trembling. My parents were already speaking, asking what was wrong, but I barely heard them. My eyes were locked on the wardrobe, my breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. It was still, completely still. My mom flipped on the overhead light, the sudden brightness making my eyes sting. My dad crossed the room, pulling the wardrobe doors open in one swift motion. Clothes, toys, old books, all exactly where they should be. Nothing out of place. Nothing inside. Nothing there. They told me I was dreaming, that I had imagined it, that I had worked myself up because of a bad dream. They checked under my bed, in the closet, in every possible place something could hide. Nothing. But I know what I felt. I know what I saw. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I just sat in bed, knees pulled to my chest, my eyes never leaving the wardrobe. Every tiny noise made my skin crawl. Every shadow made my breath catch. I waited for something else to happen, for the tapping to return, for the wardrobe to shake again. But nothing did. By morning, the fear had settled into something else. Not relief, not comfort, just a cold, quiet knowing. It happened again, years later. I was older then, wiser. I had mostly outgrown my fear of werewolves, of monsters in the dark. But one night, I woke up, same position, facing the wall, and I felt it again. A tap. The same precise, calculated touch. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. This time, I didn't even count. I just waited. It lasted longer this time. Maybe 15 minutes. Maybe more. Then, as before, it stopped. And when I finally gathered the courage to turn, my wardrobe shook again. I told my parents the next morning. They brushed it off. Said I had always been imaginative. That I had a habit of dreaming things so vividly, I believed they were real. But here's the thing. I don't believe in ghosts. I don't believe in fairy tales or spirits or things lurking in the dark. But I believe in what I felt. And I know the difference between a dream and something real. I never figured out what happened. Never got an explanation. But to this day, even as an adult, I never sleep with my back to the room. Just in case. The morning air was crisp as I pulled into the RV park. The sun was still low, casting long shadows across the gravel lot. The place was quiet except for the distant hum of traffic from the highway and the occasional chirp of birds waking up in the trees. My parents had been staying here for a few weeks, parked in their usual spot near the back of the lot where the trees provided some shade. I had been coming by most mornings to have coffee with my dad before heading off to work. It was a small routine, but one I enjoyed. I parked my car a few spots away from their trailer and stepped out, stretching as I walked toward the door. The air smelled fresh, a little damp from the dew that still clung to the grass. I remember thinking how peaceful it all felt. It was a simple morning, nothing out of the ordinary, just another visit before the rest of my day began. I knocked lightly before grabbing the handle to let myself in. The moment I cracked the door open, everything changed. A wall of heavy, sickeningly strong gas hit me in the face, thick and suffocating, as if the air itself had turned poisonous. My stomach twisted, my throat clenched, and my eyes burned from the intensity of it. It was the unmistakable smell of propane, sharp, chemical wrong. I staggered back, almost gagging, my head already pounding from just a few seconds of exposure. My body screamed at me to get away, but my brain was locked in a slow, dragging panic. My parents were inside. I forced myself to push the door open wider, trying not to breathe too deeply as I stepped up into the RV. The smell only got worse. It was everywhere, clinging to everything, so thick it felt like it was coating my skin. The air was heavy, suffocating, unnatural. My dad was sitting in his usual chair, looking at me with confusion. Just sitting there, like nothing was wrong. His expression was almost casual, like he was waiting for me to say something. But I could barely focus on him. My chest was tightening, my vision swimming. The smell was overwhelming, pressing into me, making my whole body feel sluggish and nauseous. My legs were trembling under me, my lungs burning. How could he not smell it? How could he just be sitting there like everything was fine? I tried to force my thoughts through the fog of dizziness creeping into my head. Get out. Get them out. Now. Asterisk, asterisk. I turned sharply, sucking in fresh air the moment I was back outside. It was like breaking through the surface of water after being held under too long. My vision cleared a little, the dizziness fading just enough for me to think again. The gas. It had been leaking all night. Hours. They should be dead. My heart was slamming against my ribs as I turned back, holding my breath, and reached inside to yank the door open wider. My dad blinked at me, still looking confused, but now moving slower, more sluggish. He was groggy, dazed. I didn't need to ask why. He'd been breathing this in for who knows how long. I forced myself to step back in, just enough to grab his arm. My head spun again, my stomach threatening to heave, but I ignored it and pulled him toward the door. He was moving too slow, like his limbs were heavy. His skin felt clammy under my grip. I don't remember exactly how I got him outside. I just know one moment he was in that chair, and the next he was out in the fresh air, blinking like he was just waking up. My mom was still inside. I turned back, hesitating only for a second before plunging in again. It felt worse this time, like my body knew what I was doing was dangerous and was trying to stop me. My head felt light, my vision dark around the edges. I could feel my pulse hammering in my skull, a warning I couldn't afford to listen to. She was in the back, still in bed. The air was heavier there, thicker, like the gas had pooled low, waiting. My stomach twisted as I reached for her, shaking her shoulder hard enough that she stirred. She mumbled something, barely opening her eyes. I didn't waste time trying to wake her properly. I just grabbed her and pulled. My arms were weak, trembling, but I didn't stop. I dragged her out of bed, barely managing to hold her up as I half carried, half dragged her toward the front. Each step felt harder than the last, like my legs were turning to lead. The air was eating away at me, pressing in, squeezing the strength from my body. By the time I got to the door, my vision was closing in. My chest felt too tight, my lungs burning. I stumbled, almost collapsing at the threshold, but somehow managed to keep moving. One step, another, then air. I gasped, my whole body shuddering as I fell back onto the grass. My head was spinning, the world tilting violently, but the air was clearing, the weight lifting just enough for me to think again. I looked over at my parents. My dad was sitting on the grass, still looking dazed. My mom was awake now, groggy but breathing. I could see the confusion on their faces, but there was something else too, a flicker of realization. I turned back to the RV, staring at it as my mind started piecing things together. The stove, the burner. It must have been left on just enough for gas to leak out all night. Hours and hours of propane filling every inch of that tiny space. If I had come even an hour later, I didn't finish the thought. I didn't need to. The only reason they were alive was that my mom, who never left windows open at night, had, for some unknown reason, cracked one open just enough. Enough to let some of the gas escape. Enough to keep the concentration from reaching its deadly tipping point. Enough to save their lives. I sat there for a long time, my body still trembling, my breath still shallow. The RV loomed in front of me, the smell still lingering around the open door. The morning still felt peaceful, the birds still chirping, the sun still rising like nothing had happened. But everything had changed. I had almost walked into a tomb that morning, and if I hadn't shown up when I did, I would have found them dead in their beds. The thought sent another wave of nausea through me, but I pushed it down. They were alive. That was all that mattered. I would never forget that smell, never forget how close it had been, and I would never take another morning for granted again. The woods had a way of swallowing sound. That was one of the first things I noticed whenever I went on these solo trips. Out here, away from towns and roads, everything was muffled, except for the occasional snap of a twig or the rustling of something moving just beyond sight. Even the wind barely made a sound, just a whisper through the leaves. I had been hiking for most of the day, testing out my bug-out bag and gear, like I'd done plenty of times before. This trip wasn't about relaxing. It was about seeing what worked and what didn't. Every time I went out, I'd adjust my setup, lighten the load, swap out tools, figure out what was actually useful versus what was just weighing me down. That was the whole point. I wanted to know that if I ever needed to rely on this gear for real, I wouldn't be finding out the hard way that something was useless. By the time I found a decent spot to camp, the sun was low. It wasn't dark yet, but the shadows stretched long, and the light had that deep orange glow that signaled the day was almost done. The place I picked was just off the main trail, tucked between a pair of sturdy trees that were the perfect distance apart from my military hammock tent. Setting it up was second nature by now. I got the straps around the trees, made sure everything was level, then secured the rain fly. My tent blended right in, OD green, barely visible unless you were looking for it. That was the point. I didn't need to be seen. Once the hammock was up, I got a fire going. I kept it small, just enough for warmth and to boil some water. Then I started pulling out my gear, spreading it out around me to go through it. Knife, multi-tool, ferro rod, paracord, extra socks, ammo, pistol, rifle. I laid everything out, checking weights, considering what was worth carrying and what I could ditch next time. I was in the middle of testing a new compact stove when I heard movement coming down the trail. 2 people, a couple, from the sound of their voices and the way they walked. Light steps, no heavy packs, probably just out for a short hike before heading back to wherever they came from. I wasn't worried. I wasn't doing anything wrong, but I knew how I must have looked. A guy sitting alone in the woods, surrounded by gear, No tent in sight, just a fire and a pile of weapons laid out around him. They saw me. I could tell from their footsteps, first steady, then hesitant, then stopping altogether. They hadn't expected to run into someone like me. Most people hiking out here were in bright jackets, carrying little day packs. They weren't used to seeing someone with a fully loaded bug-out setup, let alone a guy sitting in front of a fire with a rifle resting on his pack. I looked up. They stood there for a second, just on the edge of my camp. Then they were gone. No small talk, no introductions. They just turned and left, quick but not running. I could almost hear them thinking, asterisk, don't act scared, just leave, don't turn your back too fast, asterisk. I couldn't blame them. If I had been in their shoes, I might have thought the same thing. Some guy alone in the woods, armed to the teeth, no tent in sight? If they hadn't seen the hammock, they probably thought I was just sleeping in the dirt like some lunatic survivalist. I sighed, shaking my head as their footsteps faded. That was something I never really thought about before. I spent so much time making sure I wasn't vulnerable out here that I never considered what it might look like to someone else. To me, this was just a routine gear test. To them, it must have been like stumbling across a backwoods psycho in the middle of nowhere. It was a funny thought. I ate my meal, packed up the gear I wasn't using, and climbed into the hammock. Like always, sleep didn't come easy. The hammock shifted with every move, swaying gently between the trees. The fabric was thin enough that I could feel the cold seeping through my back, even with the sleeping pad underneath me. I'd dealt with worse, though. Somewhere in the night, I woke up to the sound of something moving outside my camp. I stayed still listening. Could have been anything. A deer, a raccoon, maybe even just the wind. I checked my watch, just past 3 a.m. I reached down slowly, feeling for my flashlight. Then I stopped. The last thing I wanted was to light myself up like a beacon. Instead, I listened. Waited. Whatever it wasn't coming closer. Just passing through. I let my eyes close again. Morning came slow. The sky was a dull gray when I crawled out of the hammock. The fire had burned out to cold ash, and everything was damp with morning dew. I packed up quick, breaking down the hammock and loading up my gear. No point in hanging around longer than I needed to. As I made my way back to the main trail, I thought about that couple again. They were probably still talking about me. Maybe they'd tell their friends about the weirdo they ran into in the woods, the guy with all the guns sitting by a fire with no tent. I smirked. Next time, I'd set up camp a little deeper in, out of sight, just in case. I went to a small college in Pennsylvania in the 1980s. It was the kind of place that felt safe, the kind of town where people didn't lock their doors, where the biggest crime you heard about was someone getting too drunk and making a fool of themselves at a party. But during the spring of 1985, everything changed. A guy was going around mugging women near campus. At first, it seemed like random attacks, someone walking back to their dorm alone, a girl cutting through a dark parking lot, another walking home from the library after hours. We all thought it was just about money, but deep down, none of us really believed that. Something about it didn't feel right. Back then, we weren't allowed to have anything for self-defense. No mace, no pepper spray, nothing. So we got creative. A lot of girls carried metal dining hall forks in their bags. Some tucked nail files into their pockets or bags. I kept a metal nail file on my nightstand next to a giant can of hairspray. That stuff wasn't just for big 80s hair. It was flammable. It stung like hell if sprayed in someone's eyes, and it gave me a little peace of mind. I was lucky enough to have a dorm room to myself that semester. Most of the time, I loved it. The extra space, the quiet, not having to deal with a roommate's mess. But after the attack started, being alone at night didn't feel so great. Every night before bed, I checked the closet, under the bed, made sure my window was locked. I even had a system for emergencies. Before I went to sleep, I would dial the phone number of our dorm counselor, let it ring once, and then hang up. That way, if anything happened, I could just hit redial, and he'd be on the other end. I never really expected to need it. Then one night, everything changed. It was late. I don't remember the exact time, but most of the girls on my floor had already settled in for the night. Some were probably still awake, reading or talking, but the hallway was quiet. No music, no voices, just that kind of peaceful stillness that makes you feel safe. Then I heard the stairwell door open. It wasn't loud, but in the silence, it was enough to make my stomach clench. I sat up in bed, heart suddenly pounding. The only people who used that stairwell at this time of night were the girls who lived on this floor. But this didn't sound like one of them. The footsteps were slow, heavy, and then came the breathing. It was deep, labored, like someone struggling to control themselves. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I sat there frozen, barely breathing, listening as he moved down the hall. I could hear the shuffle of his shoes, the way he stopped at each door for just a moment before moving on. My stomach twisted. Then he stopped outside my door. I could see his shoes through the crack under the doorframe. Scuffed sneakers, dark-colored, too big to belong to any of the girls who lived here. His breathing got louder. I sat there, gripping the blanket, so hard my fingers ached. My heart was pounding so hard I thought he might hear it. I tried to remind myself that my door was locked, that he couldn't get in, but that didn't make me feel any better. Then I heard a snap. My dry erase board. We all had them on our doors for leaving messages. I had a marker attached to mine with a little plastic clip. I heard the sound of it breaking off, followed by the quiet clatter of plastic hitting the floor. Then nothing. I sat there frozen, staring at the tiny space under the door. Then his fingers appeared. Just the tips, barely visible, reaching under the door as he fumbled to pick up the marker. My whole body locked up. My skin felt too tight, my breath stuck in my throat. The fingers disappeared. A second later, I heard the soft click of the marker being snapped back into place. Then the footsteps started again, moving farther down the hall. I didn't move. I couldn't. Then he stopped again. I realized, with sudden horror, where he had stopped. The girl down the hall. The only one who hadn't locked her door. I didn't even have time to think before I heard it. A sudden rustling. Movement. A shift in the air, like something was about to happen. Then the screams. "Get the fuck out of my room." The words came out in a panicked shriek, followed by another voice, just as terrified, just as angry. The spell that had been holding me in place shattered. I lunged for my phone, hitting redial. But I wasn't the only one. Suddenly, the whole dorm was alive with noise. Doors unlocking, feet hitting the floor, the sound of someone sprinting down the hallway. Then, just as suddenly, a door slammed open. I heard him bolt. His footsteps pounded against the linoleum. Then the stairwell door slammed shut so hard it rattled the walls. Then silence. For a second, no one moved. Then every door on the floor flew open at once. We all spilled out into the hallway, voices tumbling over each other, some girls crying, others yelling. My dorm counselor was already on his way up, a campus cop right behind him. The girl he had gone after was shaking but unhurt, standing in her doorway with her roommate, still pale from shock. They caught him that night. He didn't get far. Campus security spotted him running and tackled him before he even made it off school property. I didn't sleep that night. None of us did. We stayed up together in one of the bigger rooms, talking in hushed voices, still on edge, still processing what had happened. The next day, the rumors started. The cops said he had been watching her, that she wasn't just a random target, that this had been planned. We still didn't know exactly what he wanted to do, but it was clear it wasn't just a mugging. And then I found out something that made my stomach drop. He was in my math class. I had sat near him, maybe even spoken to him, without realizing what he was. I hadn't noticed anything off about him. I had just assumed he was another student, just another face in the crowd. That was the scariest part of all. He wasn't some shadowy figure lurking in the dark. He was just there, blending in, invisible until the moment he wasn't. After that night, I never slept in my dorm room alone again. When I was a kid, there was a massive building in our neighborhood that used to be an army barracks. It was an old, sprawling structure with high gray walls and rows of small, rectangular windows, all lined up like empty eye sockets. By the time I was old enough to care about it, the place had already been turned into a nursery. My parents told me that before I was born, soldiers had lived there. The idea of people sleeping in rows of bunks, marching around in boots, and training in the courtyard made it seem even bigger, even more mysterious. But to me, and most of the kids my age, it was just a place where toddlers went during the day. When I was about 8, they shut the place down. The building was just too old. They moved the nursery across the street into a new, modern-looking place, and the old barracks were left to rot. At first, nothing really changed. The building was still standing, but now the windows were dark, and no one went in or out. The gate at the front, which had once stood open for parents dropping off their kids, was locked with a thick chain. It felt strange passing by, seeing it so still. The old army building had always been full of noise, children laughing, parents calling out, teachers blowing whistles. Now it was silent. That silence didn't last long. Older kids in the neighborhood started messing with it. I don't know who broke the first window, but once one was shattered, more followed. Within weeks, most of the glass on the lower floor was gone, leaving sharp edges that caught the light at sunset. Some kids even managed to pry open a side door. After that, it became a hangout for teenagers looking for a thrill. They filmed themselves sneaking inside, walking through the dark hallways, whispering into the camera like ghost hunters. They called it exploring lost places, but it was more about proving they weren't scared. They uploaded their videos online, showing shaky footage of peeling wallpaper, old toys left behind, and graffiti scrawled on the walls. They made up stories about the place, about the army, about the nursery, about kids who had supposedly disappeared. I watched every video I could find, my stomach twisting with a mix of fear and fascination. I wanted to go inside. One evening, I told my best friend about it. We sat on the curb across the street from the abandoned building, watching the last bit of daylight fade behind it. I imagined what it would be like to step through that broken door, to walk the empty hallways where soldiers and little kids had once stood. My friend wasn't so sure. He told me it was stupid, that we'd get caught, that our parents would kill us. But I could tell he was curious too. We never got the chance. One night, everything changed. It started with the sound of sirens. My parents had already put me to bed, but I heard them echoing through the neighborhood, one after another, getting louder. I sat up in the dark, my heart pounding. I ran to my window and pushed the curtains aside, just in time to see the blue and red lights flashing against the cracked walls of the barracks. At first, I thought maybe someone had set a fire, or maybe the police had finally caught some of the kids who snuck inside. But then more vehicles arrived. Police, ambulances. There were officers standing by the entrance, talking into their radios. People were gathering on the sidewalk, whispering, pointing. I wanted to know what was happening. I slipped out of my room as quietly as I could, my socks silent on the wooden floor. My parents were in the living room, watching from the window. My dad's arms were crossed. My mom was biting her lip. I crept up beside them, staying just out of their line of sight. Then I saw the stretcher. It came out of the building slowly, carried by 2 paramedics. There was something on it, covered by a thick white sheet. The shape underneath was too still. I swallowed hard. A body. The next morning, everyone in the neighborhood was talking about it. I didn't have to ask my parents what had happened. Kids at school were already spreading the story. A group of teenagers had gone into the barracks that night, filming another one of their videos. They wandered through the dark hallways, whispering to each other, laughing. Then they found her, a dead woman. She was lying on an old bed in one of the rooms that used to be a nursery. She looked like she was asleep. She was wearing a nightgown, and she had been there for weeks. I remember how quiet it got when I heard that part. A missing person, a woman with dementia. She had wandered away from wherever she was staying, somehow made it across the street, and walked right back into the place she had once lived. Maybe in her mind, it was still the nursery. Maybe she thought she still belonged there. She found an old bed, laid down, and never woke up. She had been missing for so long that by the time the kids found her, the cold had taken its toll. For days, I couldn't stop thinking about her. I imagined her walking through the empty halls, confused, looking for familiar faces that weren't there. I imagined her lying down, pulling the blanket over herself, feeling safe in a place that hadn't been safe for years. I imagined the moment she closed her eyes, believing that when she woke up, the world would be the way she remembered it. The old barracks didn't last long after that. The police kept people away for a while, and then the demolition crews arrived. They tore it down piece by piece until there was nothing left but rubble. Then they cleared that away too. Eventually, they built a playground where it once stood. Bright yellow slides, swings, a merry-go-round. But sometimes, even years later, when I walked past that playground, I still pictured the building that used to stand there. I still pictured the woman in the nightgown, lying down in her old bed, closing her eyes, waiting to wake up. It started as just another trip. My grandparents had always been the kind of people who lived for the open road, and back in the early 90s, They spent most of their free time on their motorcycle, traveling across the country with no particular destination in mind. They'd gone all over the place, Arizona, Colorado, Louisiana. But on this trip, they'd ridden all the way up to Washington and were making their way back home to Texas, taking their time and enjoying the ride. At some point on the way back, they passed through New Mexico. My grandpa loved the desert, and my grandma loved stopping at roadside shops. So when they saw a small store on the side of a quiet two-lane highway deep in Navajo country, they decided to pull over. It was a small, unassuming place. Just a little wooden shop with a hand-painted sign, the kind of thing you see all over the Southwest. Tourist traps full of little trinkets, cheap jewelry, postcards, and pottery. But this one wasn't quite like that. My grandma said there was something different about it, though she could never explain what. The shopkeeper, a quiet native man who looked to be in his late 50s or 60s, greeted them politely. He wasn't overly friendly, but he was respectful and willing to chat. My grandma spent some time browsing, while my grandpa talked to the man about their trip. He told them about the area, the land, how long his family had been there. At some point, my grandma found a small wooden figurine on a shelf near the counter. It was carved from dark wood, simple but well-made, and had a strange, almost solemn expression. She picked it up, running her fingers over the rough surface, and asked about it. The shopkeeper nodded and said he made them himself. He had several more on another shelf, small wooden figures, all with that same strange expression, though each one was slightly different. He didn't say much else about them, but my grandma liked the craftsmanship. She picked out a couple and bought them. That was it. Nothing strange happened at the store. Nothing about the figures seemed particularly unusual. My grandparents said their goodbyes, packed the little wooden carvings carefully in their bags, and continued on their way. By the time they got home, the trip was just another memory. They unpacked, put their gear away, and went about their usual routine. My grandma placed the wooden figures on a small shelf in the upstairs hallway, near their bedroom, where they would be out of the way but still visible. And then for the rest of the day, nothing happened. That night, my grandpa woke up around 2 a.m. to use the bathroom. That wasn't unusual. He always got up at least once or twice during the night. He sat up, rubbed his face, and quietly made his way out of the bedroom, careful not to wake my grandma. The house was dark and silent. He didn't bother turning on the lights. He had lived there for years and knew his way around. The bathroom was just a few steps down the hall, so he walked there, did what he needed to do, and washed his hands. That's when he heard it. Footsteps. Fast, light, running footsteps. They came from the hallway just outside the bathroom. Back and forth, back and forth. The sound of bare feet hitting the hardwood floor, too quick, too deliberate. My grandpa froze, his hands still dripping over the sink. He stared at his reflection in the mirror, listening. The footsteps didn't slow down. They didn't pause. Just back and forth, over and over. Finally, after what felt like forever, he reached out and turned off the faucet. The dripping stopped. The house was silent again. He took a slow step toward the bathroom door and nudged it open just enough to see out into the hallway. Nothing. The hall was empty, dimly lit by the weak moonlight filtering in through a small window at the end. The wooden figures sat on their little shelf, completely still. But just as he was about to shake it off and step out, something caught his eye. At the very end of the hall, past the figures, where the darkness was thickest, there was something standing there. A figure. It wasn't moving. It wasn't making a sound. It was just standing there, motionless, completely black against the shadows. For a long moment, my grandpa couldn't breathe. It wasn't like a person. It wasn't like anything at all. It had no movement, no life. It was just a shape, a deep, dark silhouette at the edge of the hall. His first instinct was to turn on the lights, but something in his gut stopped him. He just kept staring, waiting for his eyes to adjust, waiting for it to make sense. But it never did. Then, after what felt like minutes but was probably only seconds, the figure began to move. Not toward him, not away. It stepped slowly, deliberately, into his bedroom, into the dark room where my grandma was still asleep. The door, which had been left slightly open, swung closed behind it with the softest click. My grandpa stood frozen in the bathroom doorway, staring at the spot where it had just been. His body felt locked in place. His mind was screaming at him to move, to do something, to wake my grandma, to turn on the lights, but he couldn't. He didn't move until the first rays of morning light crept through the window. When my grandma woke up, she immediately knew something was wrong. She found my grandpa sitting up in bed, staring at the doorway, pale as a ghost. She asked him what was wrong, and he told her everything. She didn't hesitate. She didn't ask questions. She didn't try to explain it away. She just turned and looked straight at the wooden figures on the shelf. Without a word, she took them down. She didn't break them. She didn't throw them away. She carried them outside, set them on the ground, and burned them. She didn't stop until there was nothing left but ashes. She didn't explain why. She just knew. After that, nothing strange ever happened again. My grandpa never saw the figure again, never heard the footsteps, never felt that cold, empty presence at the end of the hall. They never bought anything like that again, and my grandma never spoke about it. To this day, my grandpa says that was the most unsettling moment of his life. Not because of what he saw, but because of what he felt. That thing at the end of the hall, it wasn't alive. It wasn't dead. It was just there. And the way it moved, or rather, the way it didn't move, still haunts him to this day. I was camping in Vermont with my ex and her parents a few years ago. It was the kind of trip I had been looking forward to, a weekend away from everything, deep in the woods, surrounded by nothing but trees and open sky. I wasn't much of an outdoorsman, but I liked the idea of camping. I liked the silence, the stillness. It felt different from the constant hum of everyday life. Her parents had arrived earlier in the day and set up camp before we got there. By the time we pulled up, the site was ready, 2 tents set up near each other, a fire pit with some logs arranged in a rough circle, and a cooler packed with food. They had even gathered a good pile of firewood. The site was at the edge of a small clearing, with a thick tree line behind it. The woods stretched far back, but the trees were spaced apart enough that you could see into them for a good distance. The first thing I noticed when we got there was how empty the place felt. There were no other campers anywhere nearby. The only ones I saw were maybe 100 yards away, off in another direction, and even that was just a single tent. This wasn't one of those crowded campgrounds where families set up side by side. This was real, isolated camping. We spent the evening like you'd expect, cooking over the fire, talking, eating. The sun dipped below the trees slowly, casting long shadows through the woods. The temperature dropped with it. I remember looking out into the trees as I ate, watching the light fade between the trunks, the gaps between them getting darker. At some point, we put out the fire and went to bed. My ex and I had our own tent, separate from her parents. I crawled into my sleeping bag, exhausted from the drive and the food and the warmth of the fire. It didn't take long for me to fall asleep. Sometime in the night, I woke up. At first, I didn't know why. The tent was silent. My ex was asleep beside me, her slow, steady breathing the only sound. I lay there, blinking, trying to figure out what had pulled me from sleep. Then I heard it, crying. A woman. It was close, no more than 10 yards away from the tent. The sound was unmistakable, deep, shaking sobs, loud enough that I could hear every hitch of breath, every ragged inhale. It wasn't the distant call of an animal or the wind moving through the trees. It was human, and it was right outside. My body locked up instantly. My heartbeat slammed in my chest, my skin prickling with that deep, instinctual fear that comes when something isn't right. I listened, straining, barely breathing. The crying didn't stop. It didn't waver. It just went on, raw and awful, like someone was sitting right outside my tent, completely alone, breaking apart in the middle of the woods. I turned my head slowly toward my ex, trying to wake her. I nudged her with my elbow. Nothing. I whispered her name. Still nothing. She was completely out. I wanted to unzip the tent and look. Every part of me was screaming to do something, to see what was making that sound, to figure out if someone was actually out there. But I didn't, because I wasn't sure what would be worse. Finding someone sitting there, alone, crying in the darkness, or unzipping the tent and finding nothing at all. I had to pee, badly. My bladder felt swollen, but there was no way I was going outside. I forced myself to stay still, to breathe slow, to let the sound of the crying wash over me until, at some point, exhaustion took over. And then I was asleep again. When I woke up, it was early morning. The light filtering through the tent was a soft, cold blue. I blinked, disoriented for a second, then remembered. The crying. I sat up quickly, turning toward my ex. She was still asleep, curled up in her sleeping bag. I unzipped the tent slowly and stepped outside. The air was crisp and cool, the kind of morning chill that makes your breath come out in faint clouds. The sun hadn't fully risen yet, but the sky was clear, the first light of the day stretching through the trees. I turned immediately toward where I'd heard the crying. There was nothing. No sign of a tent. No sign of a person. No broken branches. No footprints in the dirt. Nothing that showed anyone had been there. Just empty woods. I stood there for a long time, listening to the morning silence, the occasional rustle of leaves as the wind moved through the trees. It felt wrong. Not in a supernatural way, not like a ghost story, but in a deeply unsettling, real way. Because the only thing worse than hearing a woman crying in the middle of the woods in the dead of night was finding absolutely no trace of her in the daylight. I tried to shake it off. Maybe I had dreamed it. Maybe it had been an animal. A fox, even though I knew what foxes sounded like, and this hadn't been that. I walked toward the spot where the sound had come from, stepping carefully through the underbrush. I checked behind trees, looked down at the ground for footprints, anything that would make sense of it. Nothing. I peed, then went back to the tent. By the time my ex and her parents woke up, I hadn't said a word about it. The day passed normally. We ate breakfast, hiked a little, swam in the lake nearby. I tried to enjoy myself, but my mind kept drifting back to the night before, to the sound of those sobs cutting through the trees, the way it had felt like whoever was making them had been so close. I didn't want to tell anyone. Part of it was that it sounded crazy. Another part was that I didn't want to make them uncomfortable, to plant that seed of fear in their heads. We still had another night left out here, and the last thing I wanted was for them to be on edge. That evening, as the sun dropped lower in the sky, I found myself glancing toward the tree line again. Still empty. Still nothing. But the moment the sun set, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. Like the woods were different. Like they were holding something in them now. I stayed up late that night, sitting by the fire long after everyone else had gone to bed. I didn't want to go back in the tent. I didn't want to wake up in the dark again, paralyzed, listening to something I couldn't understand. Eventually, exhaustion won out. I crawled into the tent, zipped it shut, and lay there in the silence. This time, I didn't wake up in the night. This time, there was no crying. But even as we packed up the next morning, as we loaded the car and drove away from that campsite, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been out there. And worse, that whatever it was, it had been watching me too. I never knew my grandfather's family. They were long gone before I was born, and no one spoke of them much when I was young. It wasn't until I was older that I started to understand why. The truth was horrifying, something out of a nightmare, but real. My grandmother, a woman who never showed fear easily, carried the weight of it more than anyone. The way she talked about it, or rather, the way she avoided talking about it, told me everything I needed to know. She had been there when it happened, not at the scene, but close enough. Close enough to sit beside the one who did it, before anyone knew what he had done. Close enough that, even decades later, she still shuddered at the memory. My grandfather grew up in a small, quiet town in Wisconsin. It was the kind of place where neighbors knew each other by name, where barns stood like old sentinels on sprawling fields, and where the local diner was the heart of town gossip. He wasn't raised by his birth parents, but by his grandparents. I never got the full story of why, whether his parents had passed, or if there had been something else, something unspoken. Whatever the reason, those grandparents became his family, his guardians, the only parents he truly knew. And then one night, his world was shattered. His stepbrother, a boy only 16 years old, came home late from drinking. In a house like that, under the roof of strict and hardworking people, there was no tolerance for that kind of behavior. He got a lecture. He got grounded. He was told he wouldn't be going on his date the next night. That should have been the end of it. Just another teenage rebellion met with discipline, a common enough story in any home. But for him, it wasn't just discipline. It wasn't just punishment. It was a trigger. The next night, he made a plan. A cold, deliberate plan. He called his father, my grandfather's grandfather, out to the barn. Told him there were rats that needed catching. In a place like that, rats weren't unusual. They got into the grain, chewed through the feed sacks. It wasn't strange at all to go out at night with a rifle to take care of them. So his father went. And as he walked ahead, his steps crunching over the dirt floor, the boy raised his gun and pulled the trigger. A single shot. The man collapsed, dead before he even had the chance to understand what was happening. But that wasn't enough. The boy fired again, making sure. Then he walked back to the house. His mother, my grandfather's grandmother, was inside. He told her he needed help with something in the barn. Something about the rats. Maybe she hesitated. Maybe she sensed something was off, but she went. She followed him out into the dark, across the yard, into the barn that now held a body. She bent down, peering at the ground, maybe expecting to see a rat scurrying in the shadows. And as she did, he lifted the gun and shot her in the back of the head. She crumpled, her body folding into the hay. He stood there for a moment. Maybe he was listening. Maybe he was making sure no one had heard. Maybe he was simply looking at what he had done. Then he turned back to his father's body, dragged it across the barn, over the dirt, leaving a trail behind. He pulled it to the pig pen, shoved it inside. Pigs weren't picky about what they ate. He knew that. Maybe that's why he chose that spot. Then he returned to his mother, but instead of the pig pen, he hid her under the hay. And then, as if nothing had happened, he went to his room, cleaned himself up, and got ready for his date. The next day, the town was in chaos. The grandparents weren't seen in the morning, which was unusual. Someone went looking. Someone checked the barn. Someone saw the blood. And it didn't take long before the police arrived. He was arrested quickly, without resistance. He didn't run. He didn't hide. When they asked him why he had done something so brutal, so final, his answer was chilling in its simplicity. They were treating me like a child. That was all. Not rage. Not some deep-seated hatred built over years. Not even a real grievance. Just a petulant, entitled response. My grandmother was young when it happened. Younger than my grandfather, and in some ways, it wasn't really her tragedy. It wasn't her family that had been destroyed, but she carried the horror of it with her just the same. Because before anyone knew, before the bodies were found, before the police came, before the town understood what had happened, she had sat beside him. In a car. Just a normal, everyday moment. Just sitting next to someone she had known. Someone she had probably spoken to before, laughed with, maybe even trusted. And all the while, that person had already killed. She told me once, years later, when I was old enough to grasp it, I was sitting next to the person who killed my husband's family. I could have been killed. That stuck with me. She never forgot it, and neither did I. After the arrest, the town changed. At least for my grandfather and my grandmother, it did. My grandfather had lost the people who raised him. They weren't perfect, but they were his family. And suddenly they were gone, taken in the most senseless way imaginable. The house, the barn, the land. It all became a place haunted not by ghosts, but by reality. There was no escaping what had happened there. The neighbors never looked at it the same way again. I don't know what happened to the stepbrother after he was sentenced. My grandparents never spoke of it. Maybe they didn't want to know. Maybe they didn't care. What I do know is that my grandmother never let it go. Even decades later, she would shudder when she thought about it. She would go quiet. And sometimes, in those rare moments when she spoke about it, her voice would drop, her face would go pale, and she would say, "I sat next to him. I could have been next." And every time I heard it, I felt the same thing. Chills. Because that wasn't a story. It wasn't something you told around a campfire to spook each other. It was real. It happened. And it was something my family would never, ever forget. I never thought much about him back then. He was just another kid at school, a grade below me. I didn't know his friends, didn't know what kind of life he had at home. If you had asked me before everything happened, I would have told you he was just a regular guy. Nothing about him stood out, at least not in a way that made me think he was different. If anything, he was known for something good. A couple of years before everything, he was in the papers for saving his dad's life. His father had a heart attack while swimming, and this kid, just a teenager, dragged him out of the water and kept him alive until help came. The fire department and police gave him awards. There was a banquet and everything. I remember seeing his face in the local newspaper, standing there in a button-up shirt next to the fire chief. He looked proud but uncomfortable, like he didn't know what to do with the attention. People talked about it for a while, how brave he was, how incredible it was that a kid could do something like that. Then, a few years later, he murdered an old couple in their sleep. It was the kind of thing that didn't make sense at first. You hear about stuff like that on the news, in big cities, in places far away. Not in the kind of town where people leave their doors unlocked and sit on their porches at night. Not in a neighborhood where you grew up knowing the same faces your whole life. I still remember when I found out. It was on the news, and my aunt called my mom, panicking. She lived on the same street as his family. The house he grew up in was just a few doors down from hers. The murders had happened only a couple of blocks away from her place. The couple he killed were well known in town. The man had been a judge or a district attorney. I couldn't remember which. At first, everyone thought it was some kind of revenge killing, maybe someone who had spent years in prison coming back for payback. But no, it wasn't a bitter ex-con. It was a kid from our school. A kid we all walked past in the hallways. The details of the murder came out slowly. He had broken into their house while they were out at a family dinner. Instead of stealing something or leaving, he had hidden inside their closet and waited. He sat there in the dark, listening to them come home, listening to them go to bed. And when they were asleep, he walked into their room and stabbed them both to death. There was no reason for it, no connection. He didn't know them. He wasn't robbing them. He just killed them. After the murders, people were on edge. My aunt was terrified. She had 2 little kids at the time, my cousins, ages 2 and 5. Her husband worked nights, so a lot of the time, she was home alone with them. When she found out what he had done, it shook her. But what made it worse, what made it a nightmare, was what she saw on her security cameras. The police had mentioned in their investigation that he had been checking for unlocked doors around the neighborhood, trying to find easy targets. When my aunt heard that, she went back through her camera footage from that night, and she saw him, a hooded figure walking up to her front door, reaching out and trying the handle. It didn't budge, it was locked. Then he moved to the side gate and tested it. Also locked. He just stood there for a moment, motionless. Then he turned and walked away. That was the moment that made my aunt break down. She had been home. Her kids had been asleep. If that door had been unlocked, if that gate had been open, I don't even want to think about what would have happened. At school, no one knew what to say. It didn't feel real. People whispered about it in the hallways, but it wasn't like some crime show. There were no big fights, no dramatic confrontations. Just quiet, uneasy conversations. People asking each other if they had ever talked to him, if they had ever noticed something off about him. But I had seen him just a week after the murders. I had been skipping class, wandering the halls. I turned a corner and saw him standing there, alone. He was punching the lockers, his face twisted, his body shaking. He was crying, but not the way normal people cry. It was frantic, desperate. He was pulling at his hair, gripping his head like he was trying to tear it open. And then he looked up at me. His eyes were dead. Not in a dramatic way, not in the way people describe killers in movies. Just empty, like there was nothing left inside of him. I didn't say anything. I didn't move. I just turned around and walked the other way, straight to my car. That was the last time I ever saw him in person. He got caught because he told his girlfriend. Maybe he wanted to get caught. Maybe he thought she would keep his secret. But she didn't. She went to the police. When they arrested him, people expected some kind of explanation. A reason. Something that would make it make sense. But there wasn't one. He had no history of violence. No criminal record. Nothing to explain why he had done what he did. He just did it. And that was the scariest part of all. Growing up in rural Ohio, we had the kind of childhood people these days don't believe existed. We spent our time outside. No cell phones, no video games, just bikes, ATVs, and the woods. Our parents didn't hover. They gave us a warning about not doing anything stupid and sent us on our way. Most of the time, we listened. Sometimes we didn't. There was a stretch of woods we practically lived in, a patchwork of properties belonging to local farmers who gave us permission to explore. We built forts, climbed trees, tracked deer, and played war games with BB guns and slingshots. It was our world, and we ruled it. The best part, we had just finished our first real treehouse. We'd spent the past week working on it, hammering old wood planks into a sturdy oak about 15 feet up. It wasn't pretty. Some of the nails were bent sideways, and the boards creaked when we stepped on them. But it was ours. It had a solid floor, a small railing around the edges, and just enough space for the 3 of us to sleep. My brothers, Jake and Adam, were older, 13 and 16, and they handled most of the construction while I handed them tools and held the boards steady. The night we finished it, we decided to camp out to celebrate. We brought our sleeping bags, a few snacks, and our headlamps. We had parked our ATVs on a patch of packed dirt below the treehouse and set up a small fire pit nearby. After dark, we sat around the fire, talking about random things, school, hunting, what we'd add to the treehouse next. The fire crackled, sending embers floating up into the cool night air. The woods around us felt peaceful, dark and quiet except for the occasional chirp of crickets and the rustling of leaves in the breeze. When the fire burned low, we climbed up into the treehouse and crawled into our sleeping bags. The boards underneath us weren't comfortable, but we didn't care. The air smelled like smoke and dirt, the night sounds were soft and steady, and we had the kind of tired satisfaction that came from a long day of work. Sleep came fast. I don't know what woke me at first. It wasn't a noise, not yet. Just that weird feeling, like my body knew something was wrong before my brain caught up. I blinked groggy and rolled onto my side, pulling my sleeping bag tighter. Then I heard it, a soft, scraping sound. I froze, ears straining. It came again, long, deliberate, like claws dragging against metal. Our ATVs. My heart started pounding. I turned my head toward Jake and Adam, but in the dim light, I could barely see them. I reached for my headlamp, but before I could turn it on, there was a loud bang, something slamming against the trailer we used to haul firewood behind the ATVs. Then another. I clicked my headlamp on and aimed it down. My stomach dropped. 6 coyotes stood in a loose circle around our camp. Not normal ones. These were big, bigger than any I'd ever seen, almost the size of German shepherds. Their fur looked thick and matted, their bodies lean but muscular, built for running, hunting. They weren't yipping or howling like you'd expect. They were silent, staring at the treehouse with dark, glassy eyes. One of them stood near the ATV trailer, its front paws on the metal, scratching at it like it was trying to get inside. Another sniffed around our fire pit, its nose twitching, ears flicking in our direction. I didn't breathe. I wanted to wake my brothers, but I was too scared to move. My fingers felt locked around the headlamp. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. Then, one of the coyotes lifted its head and sniffed the air. It turned, locking eyes with me. I don't know if animals can sense fear, but in that moment, I felt like prey. It took a slow step forward, then another. Wood creaked beside me. I turned my head just enough to see Adam waking up, rubbing his eyes. His brows furrowed when he saw my expression. Then he followed my gaze down, and I saw his whole body go rigid. Jake woke up next. The second he saw them, he reached for his flashlight. The beam cut through the dark, landing on the coyotes. They flinched but didn't run. The one by the trailer let out a low growl, its lips curling back over sharp yellow teeth. That's when I realized we had a problem. If it had just been 1 or 2, we could have scared them off. Made noise, thrown something. But 6? And the way they were acting, cautious but not afraid, it wasn't normal. I'd seen coyotes before. They usually kept their distance. These ones weren't backing down. We had no guns, no way to call for help, and there was no chance we were climbing down. For what felt like forever, we just sat there, barely breathing, watching them. They circled the camp, sniffing at our gear, scraping at the dirt. One jumped up, putting its front paws on the tree trunk, stretching toward us before dropping back down. They were patient. They knew we had to come down eventually. The hours dragged by. The night air felt colder. My legs ached from being curled up, but I didn't dare move too much. My headlamp battery was running low, and Jake had already shut his off to save power. We sat in near darkness, watching the shadows move below. Every time I started to think maybe they'd left, one of them would shift, a pair of glowing eyes catching the dim moonlight. I started counting the minutes, waiting for sunrise. The first sign of morning was a faint blue light on the horizon. The darkness softened, the trees taking on shape again. The coyotes were still there, but they had started to move more, pacing, stretching. One yawned, its jaws opening wide, showing a long pink tongue and rows of sharp teeth. Then, just like that, they started leaving. Not all at once. The first one wandered off, disappearing into the brush. Then another. The biggest one, the one that had been scratching at the trailer, stood still for a long moment, staring up at us, before finally turning and trotting after the others. We waited another 15 minutes before moving. Even then, we climbed down slow, scanning the woods, ready to jump back up if they returned. The second our feet hit the ground, we ran for the ATVs. My hands were shaking as I yanked my helmet on and started the engine. Adam and Jake were right behind me. The second they were ready, we tore out of there, tearing down the dirt trails as fast as the engines would go. We didn't stop until we hit our driveway. We parked, breathing hard, hands shaking. I looked back toward the woods. half expecting to see them standing there, watching us. But the trees were still. We never stayed overnight in that treehouse again. Later, we told our dad what happened. He wasn't surprised. He told us coyotes had been getting bolder lately, less afraid of people. Farmers had spotted bigger ones, and some said they were mixing with wolves. I don't know if that's true, but I know what I saw. We kept going back to the woods, but things felt different after that night. We never camped out again, and I never forgot those eyes in the dark. I didn't expect anything unusual that morning. The sky was overcast, the air cool enough that I figured we'd have a slow day at work. Most people only came out for jet ski rentals when the sun was out, when the water was glistening under a clear sky. Cloudy days like this meant less business, which usually translated to an easy shift. I walked down the path toward the dock, my bag slung over one shoulder, already thinking about how the day might go. Maybe we'd get a few customers, but with the wind picking up slightly and the occasional ripple in the water, I figured most people wouldn't want to be out there. Then I saw them, my coworkers, running. At first, it didn't click. The dock wasn't normally a place for rushing. We had a routine, checking in customers, guiding them to their jet skis, making sure they understood the rules before sending them out onto the water. But this wasn't that. This was different. I could see them moving fast, heading toward the jet ski we always kept tied to the dock for emergencies. Something was wrong. I didn't hesitate. I picked up my pace, tossing my bag onto a nearby bench as I stepped onto the dock, scanning the water. My coworkers were already pulling away, heading toward a spot farther out. The moment my eyes found what they were rushing toward, my stomach tightened. A man in the water. Even from a distance, I could tell he was big. Not just overweight, but solid, thick. Someone who probably had strength, but in the water, strength only went so far. I didn't even clock in. I just moved. We had an extra jet ski on the dock, and I hopped onto it, pulling away from the dock as quickly as I could. My eyes stayed locked on the scene ahead of me as I closed the distance. By the time I reached them, they had already gotten him onto the rescue board. That was a relief, at least, but the moment I saw him up close, something in my chest tightened. His head was tilted slightly to the side, eyes half-lidded, mouth slack. He wasn't struggling, wasn't calling for help. He wasn't fighting the way most people did when they fell off and couldn't get back on. I swallowed hard. One of my coworkers, already breathing heavy from the effort of keeping him steady, saw me approach and jerked his head toward the dock. I didn't ask questions. I just followed the silent order. The man's weight made the jet ski sluggish, the water slapping harder against the sides as I adjusted my grip. We weren't that far from the dock, but it felt farther than it should have. Then mid-drive back, it hit me. I wasn't just helping a customer who'd fallen into the water. This wasn't just someone struggling to climb back onto their jet ski. This man was dying. It didn't make sense at first. He was young, maybe early 30s at most. He looked like the kind of guy who worked out at least a little, someone with some muscle under the bulk. But he wasn't talking, wasn't gasping, wasn't doing anything that a normal panicked person would do. I pushed the jet ski forward harder, my hands tight on the grips, my heart picking up speed to match the rush of the water beneath me. As soon as we reached the dock, I barely had time to kill the engine before my coworker and I were hauling him up. I wasn't a big person. Neither was my coworker. But somehow adrenaline took over. We gritted our teeth, ignored the strain in our arms, and lifted. The second his body was on the dock, I reached for his wrist. My fingers pressed into his skin, searching, hoping. There. A pulse. But weak. I didn't think. Just moved. My coworker and I knew what to do, knew what had to be done, even though neither of us had ever done it for real. I'd practiced CPR before, had learned it, had drilled it, but never like this. Never on someone whose life was hanging by a thread. I pressed down, counted, breathed when I had to. I could feel the seconds stretching, my brain trying to stay locked into the motions, refusing to let the panic take hold. My arms ached, my palms burned against his chest, but I didn't stop. Somewhere in the distance, I heard sirens. They should have sounded harsh, jarring. But they didn't. They were relief. A signal that we weren't alone in this. That help was coming. When the paramedics arrived, they took over fast. The second I stepped back, I felt the exhaustion hit me like a wave, my body swaying slightly as I moved out of the way. My breath was ragged, my muscles trembling from the effort. And then it was out of our hands. We stood there, a group of kids who hadn't expected to be part of something like this, watching as the professionals did their jobs. I could see my coworkers' faces, the shock settling in. None of us had spoken much, and when the police chief came over to us, his words barely registered. Something about how we'd done great, how we'd given the man a fighting chance. I barely processed it. My brain was still catching up, still stuck on the feel of his chest under my hands, the sound of the sirens, the way everything had blurred together so quickly. Then our boss made the call. The day was over. We were done. The car ride to my coworker's place was strange. At first, we were all quiet, still processing, but then the adrenaline started to shift. The realization that we had done everything right set in, and slowly, the mood changed. There were smiles, even laughter. We had saved him. We had done everything we could. I felt my phone buzz. I almost didn't answer, almost let it ring. But then I saw my boss's name on the screen. I picked up. The moment I heard his voice, I knew. There was something in his tone, something heavy, something that didn't need words to explain itself. The man had died. I remember staring at the road ahead, my grip tightening around the phone. I remember the weight in my chest, the way the air seemed to shift around me. And then I remembered, I had to tell everyone else. The moment I said it, the energy in the car changed again. Silence, a stillness that felt too thick, too suffocating. I didn't know how to process it. None of us did. We had done everything right. Everything. And yet, it hadn't been enough. For the rest of the night, I kept thinking about him. About his body in the water. About the way we had pulled him out, fought for him, given him every chance. And yet, in the end, we had no control. It was a reminder that sometimes, no matter how hard you try, life isn't something you can predict. It can turn on you in an instant. And one day, it'll be me. One day, it'll be all of us. I still think about him sometimes. The man in the water. The man who was there one moment and gone the next. I don't remember his name. I don't know what his life was like before that day. But I know I was there for his last moments. And that stays with me. I was in middle school when it happened. The news spread fast, like it always does in a small town. At first, it was just whispers, rumors bouncing around the hallways, distorted and exaggerated with every retelling. A missing kid, 5 years old. Nobody knew where he went. I remember the helicopters the most. For days, they swarmed the sky like vultures, circling over the woods, the fields, the neighborhoods. The sound was constant, a deep, droning hum that never seemed to stop. You could hear it even inside the school, through the thick brick walls and the rattling windows. It was on the news, too, every night. Reporters standing in front of our town's streets, their voices serious, their words careful. The boy's mother, crying, shaking, begging for help. It was the kind of thing you don't think could happen in your own town. Not here. Not in the place where you ride your bike down empty roads at dusk, where everyone knows each other's names, where nothing ever really happens. But it did, and we all watched it unfold. The search lasted days, weeks. The police went through everything. The woods, the lake, the abandoned houses on the outskirts of town. Nothing. No clues. No leads. Just a 5-year-old boy, gone without a trace. Then, they searched the mother's house. That's when things started to feel wrong. The news didn't hold back. The house was filthy, animal waste covering the floors, needles in every room. The kind of place you wouldn't let a stray dog live in, let alone a child. It was hard to believe at first. People saw the mother crying on TV, saw the way her voice cracked when she talked about her missing son. It didn't add up. The town felt different after that. Unsettled. The way people looked at each other changed, like everyone was waiting for something worse to happen. Then it did. The confession came out of nowhere. One night, the boy was alive. The next, he wasn't. The parents beat him. That was all it took. A 5-year-old, small and defenseless, killed by the people who were supposed to love him the most. Because he wet the bed, they didn't even try to hide it well. Just put him in a bag and buried him in a shallow grave. Not out in the woods. Not somewhere nobody would ever go. But right next to my middle school. A place I walked past every day. A place where kids ran and laughed, played soccer, waited for their rides home. He had been there the whole time. If his mother hadn't confessed, he might have stayed there forever. The police sealed off the area fast. Yellow tape, flashing lights, officers standing shoulder to shoulder. But it didn't stop the whispers. They found him in the dirt. It wasn't far from the edge of the school property. If you walked a little past the field, past the chain link fence, into the trees, you would have been right on top of it. Just a few steps off the path. That close. It made me sick. I thought about every time I had stood there, waiting for the bus. Every time I had sat on the grass, eating lunch outside. Had he been there then? Was I that close to him? To the place where they threw him away like he was nothing? That thought wouldn't leave me. It made everything feel different. The funeral was small, quiet. Some people showed up because they felt like they had to. Others just couldn't bear the thought of a little boy leaving the world without anyone to mourn him. The parents weren't there, obviously. They were in jail. But it didn't matter. Nothing could fix what they did. And the town didn't forget. For months, people talked about it like it had just happened yesterday. The way the mother cried on TV, fooling everyone. The way nobody had questioned anything until it was too late. The way the police had searched and searched, while he had been right there the whole time. Some things stick with you. I don't go near that place anymore. Even though the dirt was covered up, even though the school put up a fence, even though it's been years. It doesn't matter. I still feel it. We all do. And we always will. I was at work, standing by my boss's desk, talking about the news. Some kids had gone missing, and the whole town was tense. People were locking their doors earlier, keeping an eye on their kids, and talking about safety more than usual. It had been the kind of story that stuck with you, the kind that made you wonder about the people around you, about how danger didn't always look like a stranger in the shadows. It could be someone who smiled at you, shook your hand, and made polite conversation. My boss listened, nodding along, and then, after a moment, he leaned back in his chair and said something I wasn't expecting. He said he had a story like that, something that had happened to him when he was a kid. He was about 10 or 11 at the time, growing up in a small town, the kind of place where people didn't lock their doors at night, where you knew your neighbors and life felt simple. His family had an old truck they were trying to sell, nothing special, just a reliable vehicle that had served its time and needed a new owner. One day they got a call. A man was interested. He wanted to come by, take a look, and see if it was something he could use. His parents agreed, gave him their address, and told him to stop by whenever he had the time. It was a normal thing, something they had done before with other cars, lawnmowers, even furniture. It didn't seem strange. When the man arrived, he was polite, friendly even. He wasn't old, but not young either, maybe in his late 30s or early 40s. He had short hair, a little bit of stubble, and the kind of face you wouldn't remember if you passed him on the street. He wasn't too tall, wasn't too short. He was just normal. My boss, as a kid, watched from a distance while his dad talked to him, showing him the truck, pointing out different things about it. The man listened, asked questions, seemed interested. After a while, he nodded, smiled, and said he'd take it. His dad was happy. A sale was a sale. The man handed over the money, cash, right there on the spot. No haggling, no complaints. Just a quick, clean deal. Maybe that should have been a sign, but at the time, it just felt like luck. A smooth transaction. Since he was there, and they were already talking, his mom invited him inside for lunch. That wasn't unusual. In their town, people did things like that. If someone stopped by and they were friendly, you offered them a drink, maybe a sandwich. Hospitality was second nature, and this guy didn't seem any different than the other folks who had bought things from them before. So he came inside. He sat at their table, eating a sandwich his mom made, drinking a cold soda, making small talk about the weather, about the town, about nothing in particular. My boss, just a kid at the time, sat across from him, eating his own food, barely paying attention. The man wasn't strange. He wasn't acting nervous or fidgety. He was calm, relaxed, like someone who had nowhere to be, like someone who wasn't in a rush. Eventually, he finished eating, thanked them, shook hands with his dad again, and left. They watched him drive off in the truck, the one he now owned, and then they went about their day. It wasn't something they thought much about. Just another sale, another person passing through. A few hours later, the cops showed up. Not just one officer, but multiple. They pulled up in more than one car, parked in the driveway, got out, and walked toward the house. His dad stepped outside, confused, asking what was going on. They wanted to know about the man who had just been there, the man who had bought the truck, the one they had just sat across from at the table, sharing a meal, treating like any other person. His dad told them everything. Described him, told them his name, if that was even his real name. Told them about the truck, when he left, which direction he went. Then the cops told them why they were there. That man had killed 2 people, nearly killed a third. A murderer, a fugitive. He had been running, hiding, trying to disappear. He had needed a vehicle, and he had found one. He had paid in cash because he couldn't use a bank. He had been calm, polite, unassuming, because that was the kind of man he was, one who didn't seem like a threat until it was too late. My boss, as a kid, listened to all of this while standing in the doorway of his house, realizing that he had sat across from a killer, that he had eaten lunch with a man who had taken lives, that someone dangerous had been inside their home, close enough to hurt them if he had wanted to. His parents were shaken. His mom was horrified. His dad, usually a man who didn't scare easily, looked sick. The cops asked more questions, then left. They had to find him, had to track him down before he could hurt anyone else. For weeks, my boss remembered looking over his shoulder, thinking about that man. What if he came back? What if he needed something else? What if he wasn't done? They didn't hear anything for a long time. No updates, no news. Just the knowledge that they had unknowingly invited a murderer into their home and let him drive away. Then one day they found out. He had been caught. Somewhere in another state, far from them, far from their town. Arrested. Locked up. It was over. But my boss never forgot. Because it made him realize something that stuck with him for the rest of his life. People like that don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they look normal. Sometimes they smile, shake your hand, say thank you, and sit across from you at the dinner table. And sometimes you don't realize how close you were to danger until it's too late. When I was 15, I agreed to be part of my friend's quinceañera court. I wasn't a dancer, but I figured it would be fun. We practiced every weekend in her living room, shoving furniture against the walls to make space. The music was always loud, the air thick with the smell of food cooking in the kitchen, and the energy was chaotic but fun. I was the only white kid in the group, but everyone treated me like family. I didn't speak much Spanish, but I was picking up bits and pieces just by being around them. Every night after practice, we took taxis home. It was normal in our small town. A lot of the Hispanic families had small businesses, including taxi services that weren't part of any official company. The cars were often unmarked, usually older models, and you just had to trust that whoever was driving was actually a taxi driver. It was just how things were. That night, practice ran late. The sun was already gone by the time we wrapped up, and we stood outside my friend's house waiting for a ride. It was me and 2 other girls. The taxi that showed up wasn't anything unusual, an old, beat-up minivan. The headlights were dim, the paint was faded, and the windows had that streaky look from years of bad car washes. The driver, an older, overweight Hispanic man, leaned over and unlocked the doors. I didn't think much of him at first. He was just another guy trying to make a living. We climbed into the back, the inside smelling faintly of cigarettes and cheap air freshener. The seats were cracked, the fabric worn down from years of use. The other girls, who spoke fluent Spanish, told him to take me home first since they knew I didn't know enough of the language to give directions well. The driver nodded, but then asked them where they lived. They told him. Then, instead of taking me home first, he drove straight to their house. I felt a small flicker of unease, but I told myself not to overreact. Maybe he had a reason. Maybe he figured it was easier to drop them off first since they lived together. Maybe he just misunderstood. The girls got out, waving at me as they shut the door. The minivan creaked as the weight shifted, and then it was just me and the driver. The air inside the vehicle suddenly felt different. I was already on high alert. I'd had bad experiences before, strange men staring at me for too long, standing too close, saying things that made my skin crawl. I wasn't stupid. I knew how things could go. But the driver just smiled in the rearview mirror, the corners of his mouth pulling his cheeks into deep wrinkles. I got this job to pay for my family a vacation, he said. Something in me eased, just a little. A family man. Maybe he wasn't so bad. Maybe I was just paranoid. We started getting closer to my neighborhood. My house was only a few turns away. I leaned forward slightly in my seat, watching the streets pass by. When we reached the road I lived on, I pointed. Turn right here. The minivan kept going. My stomach flipped. I sat up straighter. Maybe he hadn't heard me. Maybe he thought I meant the next turn. I pointed again. Turn right. Still, he kept driving. A cold, sinking feeling settled deep in my chest. I gripped the door handle. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Then he said it. You are very beautiful. You should let me take you to eat. I couldn't even process what he said at first. My brain was too focused on the fact that we were getting farther and farther from my street. The streetlights outside blurred past, my house shrinking farther behind me. No, thank you, I said quickly. I want to go home. He didn't acknowledge it. His hands stayed steady on the wheel, his face unreadable. Come on, he said. Aren't you hungry? My throat was dry. I wanted to run. I wanted to jump out of the car, to scream, to do something, but I was frozen in place. No, I said. Can I go home? He didn't answer. Instead, he turned into an empty parking lot. The second the tires crunched against the gravel, my body went completely numb. The lot was behind a strip of old, closed businesses. No cars, no people, just dim security lights barely illuminating the cracked pavement. I couldn't move. I couldn't think. He put the van in park. The engine rumbled softly. Then, he reached his arm around the back of my seat. Everything inside me screamed to move, to get out, to run. But my brain wasn't working right. My body was frozen. I turned my head slowly and looked at him dead in the face. I couldn't even feel my own breathing. Take me home. Now. The words came out sharp, clear, louder than I intended. For a second, nothing happened. Then, something in his face shifted. Maybe he saw the look in my eyes. Maybe he realized I was ready to scream. Maybe he just decided it wasn't worth it. Without a word, he put the car in reverse and pulled back onto the road. I sat perfectly still, my hands clenched in my lap, my whole body rigid. For the next few minutes, the only sound in the car was the hum of the engine. My mind raced. I couldn't let him know where I lived. If he knew, he could come back. He could wait for me. So I made him drop me off 3 streets over. The moment the car stopped, I reached for the door. But before I could get out, he spoke again. Can I have your number? I ignored him. I pushed open the door and stepped out onto the pavement. My legs felt like jelly, but I forced myself to stay steady. I walked up to the closest house, an elderly couple's home that I knew vaguely from passing by. I pretended it was mine. I didn't look back as I stepped toward their porch. Only when I heard the minivan's engine rumble away did I dare to move again. The second he was out of sight, I ran. Not down the road, not through the neighborhood, but straight through the woods. Branches whipped against my arms and legs. The cold air burned my lungs, but I didn't stop running. I ran until I reached my house, scrambling up the porch and inside, slamming the door behind me. I barely remembered grabbing my phone, barely remembered dialing my friends. My hands were shaking so bad I could hardly hold it. I told them everything. Their parents called the taxi service. The driver was fired immediately. It should have made me feel safe again, but it didn't. For weeks after, I couldn't shake the feeling that he might come looking for me. I jumped at every sound outside my window. I avoided walking anywhere alone. Every time I saw a minivan, my stomach twisted into knots. Even now, years later, I think about that night. And I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't spoken up, if I hadn't told him to take me home, if I had hesitated just a little too long. I wonder, but I don't ever want to know. I don't like thinking about this. Even after all these years, my stomach twists when I remember it. It wasn't some dramatic horror movie scene, and there was nothing supernatural about it. At least, not in the way people usually mean. But what happened was real, and I think that's why it still haunts me. It started with a simple plan. There were 3 of us, me, Jake, and Ryan. We were looking for a house to rent for the winter, something close to the mountains, so we could snowboard whenever we wanted without having to drive up from the city every weekend. We had spent a couple of days checking out places online, but nothing stood out. Either the locations weren't right, the prices were too high, or the houses were dumps. Then we found this place. It looked perfect. The listing showed a cabin-style house, nothing fancy, but it had everything we needed. 3 bedrooms, a decent kitchen, and a huge backyard that backed up into the woods. Best of all, it was only about a 15-minute drive from one of our favorite spots on the mountain. It was cheap too, almost suspiciously cheap, but we figured it was just because it was off-season. We called the number listed, but no one picked up. Left a message, didn't hear back. Normally, that would have been the end of it, but we were already in the area looking at another place, so we figured we'd just drive by and take a look. It was a little more isolated than we expected. The house sat at the end of a long, cracked driveway, surrounded by tall trees. There was no mailbox, and the front door had one of those old brass knockers instead of a doorbell. The windows were dark, the curtains drawn. No signs of life. We got out and walked around, trying to get a better look. The house was fine, just an empty rental, nothing creepy about it. But then we noticed the barn in the backyard. It wasn't a big barn, more like a large shed, maybe the size of a two-car garage. The paint was peeling, and the wood looked weathered, but the structure itself seemed solid. The doors weren't locked, just latched shut with an old metal hook. I don't know why we even decided to go inside. Curiosity, I guess. Jake pulled the latch free and pushed the doors open. The air inside was musty, like old wood and dust. It was mostly empty, no tools, no junk, nothing stored inside. Just an open space with a few support beams and a dirt floor. Except for the box. It sat right in the center of the floor, perfectly placed. A cardboard box, maybe the size of a shoebox, with the top flaps folded shut. We stood there for a second, staring at it. There was something off about it, something that made my skin crawl even before we touched it. It wasn't just that it was there, it was the way it was placed, like someone had carefully set it down in the middle of the barn and walked away. I don't know which one of us picked it up. Maybe Jake, maybe Ryan. But I remember the moment the box opened. Inside were photographs. Not old black and white pictures, not anything weird like bones or hair. Just photos. Of us. As kids. I remember my own face staring back at me. Maybe 7 or 8 years old, wearing a striped shirt I vaguely remembered from childhood. I don't remember the exact picture, but I knew it was real. I knew it was me. Jake and Ryan had pictures in there too. Different ages, different settings, but there was no doubt. They were pictures of us. We dropped the box. I don't know who let go first, but suddenly it was on the ground, the photos spilling out onto the dirt floor. None of us moved to pick them up. We just stood there, frozen. No one said a word. Then we left. We didn't run. We just turned and walked out, moving fast but not panicking. Not until we got back to the car. Once we were inside, with the doors shut and locked, Jake turned the key and reversed out of there so fast that the tires kicked up gravel. We didn't talk about it. Not then, not on the drive back, not in the days that followed. We just didn't. It wasn't like we sat down and made a decision never to speak of it. We just couldn't. I didn't want to hear what Jake or Ryan thought, because that would mean thinking about it myself. And I was already trying too hard to push it out of my head. And it worked. For a while. We found another rental closer to town. Not as convenient for snowboarding, but none of us complained. We never brought up the first house again. Not even when people asked why we'd picked a place farther away. But I never really forgot. A few months later, I tried to find the listing again, just to see if it was still up. But it wasn't. The house was gone, like it had never been listed at all. I searched the address online, but nothing came up. No rental history, no property records, no real estate listings. Like it had never existed. I thought about going back. Just once. Driving up to see if the house was still there, if the barn was still standing, if the box was still sitting on the floor. But I never did. Jake and Ryan refused to talk about it. If I ever hinted at it, even casually, they'd shut it down immediately. And honestly, I was okay with that. Because I don't want to know. I don't want to think about who put that box there. Or why. Or how they had those pictures. I just hope, really truly hope, that we weren't meant to find them. Because if we were, I don't think we were supposed to leave. And I think if we had stayed even a second longer, something would have made sure we didn't. Backpacking always felt like a way to escape, to break free from the constant noise of daily life. It was just me, the trail, and a group of people who all had the same idea, to challenge ourselves, to breathe in the wilderness, and to sleep under the open sky. It had never felt unsafe before. Not really. Sure, I'd had close encounters with wildlife, unpredictable weather, and some sketchy situations, but nothing had ever made me feel truly hunted. That changed on a trip where a stranger, a knife, and the cold, empty dark turned a simple hike into something I'd never forget. It was supposed to be a straightforward backpacking trip. A group of us, some old friends, some people we'd just met, had been hiking for days. We moved along forested trails, weaving through valleys and ridges, occasionally stopping at small cabins along the way. These cabins were basic, but a godsend after a long day on the trail. Nothing felt better than tossing down your pack, stretching out, and not having to pitch a tent. The sun had started to set when we arrived at a cabin for the night. It wasn't much, 4 walls, a slanted roof, and a door that had clearly seen better days. But it was empty, which was all we needed. We set up our sleeping bags, made a fire outside, and started eating whatever food we had left in our packs. That's when we met him. He had shown up alone, stepping out of the trees like he'd always been there. A man in his late 40s, maybe early 50s. Rough-looking. His clothes were dirty, his pack worn down. He had the look of someone who had been on the trail a long time, or maybe had nowhere else to go. He said he was just passing through, that he'd been hiking for weeks. We made room for him by the fire, assuming he was just another traveler looking for a place to rest. At some point, someone in our group, just trying to make friendly conversation, asked him where he was from. It was a harmless question, something you ask when you meet someone new, but something in his face changed. His eyes went cold, his whole body stiffened, and then, without warning, he pulled out a knife. Not just any knife, a big one that had no business being casually whipped out in a conversation. The air around us seemed to freeze. The crackling fire suddenly felt far too small, too dim. He gripped the handle like he had every intention of using it, his knuckles pale white. Then he started yelling, nonsense mostly. Angry, jumbled words about how people like us needed to mind our own business, about how he didn't need to answer to anybody. It wasn't rational. It wasn't normal. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. My heartbeat slammed in my ears. I was sitting on the ground, too close to the fire, too far from my pack. My first thought was that this man could kill us. Right here, right now. He was unstable. People like that don't need a reason to lash out. They just do. Then someone, maybe by instinct, maybe by sheer survival instinct, stood up. That tiny motion made everything snap into focus. Asterisk, we had to go. Now asterisk. None of us wanted to test him. Nobody wanted to see how far he was willing to take it. One by one, we started backing away from the fire, grabbing our packs as casually as we could, pretending like we weren't in a full-blown panic. We muttered some excuse about heading to bed early, slipping back toward the cabin. Except we didn't go to bed. We packed our bags in record time, every movement precise and desperate. The second we were sure he wasn't watching us, we slipped out the back of the cabin and into the trees. We hiked fast, barely speaking. The only sounds were the crunch of our boots on the dirt and the occasional snap of a branch underfoot. I kept looking back, expecting to see him following, expecting to see the glint of that knife catching in the moonlight. After a few miles, my lungs burned from the effort. The next cabin was up ahead, a similar setup to the last one. Empty. No sign of the man. We moved inside, shut the door, and tried to catch our breath. And then we heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate, right outside. We hadn't lost him. Panic slammed through me so hard I thought I might pass out. He had followed us. Mile after mile, he had tracked us through the dark. Something snapped in the group. Fear turned into something else. The man who had been leading the hike, a quiet, steady guy, reached into his pack. And when his hand came back up, he was holding a gun. He stepped outside, gun in full view. He didn't say a word. The footsteps stopped. Then the man, the one who had been chasing us, who had pulled a knife over a harmless question, asterisk, turned around and walked away, asterisk. No running, no yelling this time. Just a slow, unbothered retreat into the night. We didn't sleep. Not after that. Not knowing he was still out there, lurking somewhere in the dark. Months later, I went on a high school trip to Australia. A different kind of adventure, a different part of the world. But danger doesn't care where you are. It finds you when you least expect it. We had been worried about crocodiles from the start. The guides had warned us, but they also reassured us that we'd be safe. This particular stretch of river was calm, the water was low, and we were told that the big saltwater crocs weren't around this time of year. So we set up camp on a sandbar. It seemed like a good idea at the time. It was flat, easy to set up tents, and far from the thick brush that could hide snakes or other creatures we didn't want to deal with. We built a fire, ate dinner, and went to bed. Somewhere in the middle of the night, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure what had stirred me. Then I heard it, a low, heavy shuffling sound, the kind of noise something big makes when it moves across sand. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. The tent was thin, just a flimsy layer of fabric between me and whatever was outside. Slowly, I turned my head, trying to make out shapes through the material. And then I saw it. Not one, not two, but several crocodiles sprawled out between our tents. They weren't moving much, just resting, but they were there, right there. I had never felt more helpless in my life. I needed to pee, but there was no way in hell I was stepping outside. I stayed awake the rest of the night, frozen in place. Every tiny movement made me think about what would happen if I startled one. If it lunged, if it clamped down on a leg, an arm me. At dawn, the first hints of light crept across the sand. The crocodiles started moving, slow and lazy, slipping back into the water like they had never been there at all. When the rest of the group woke up, I stepped outside, my legs still shaky. Nobody else had noticed. They had slept peacefully, unaware that we had been surrounded all night. We packed up and left that morning. Nobody pitched their tent on a sandbar again. I had been worried about things like lightning storms, getting lost, running out of food. But those 2 nights taught me what real fear was. Fear is knowing that no matter how fast you run, someone will follow. Fear is realizing you aren't the one in control. Fear is lying awake while something bigger, stronger, and hungrier rests just inches away. And sometimes, there's nothing you can do about it. I don't remember how it started, not exactly. It wasn't the kind of thing that happens all at once, like a car crash or a sudden explosion. It crept in little moments at first, so small you wouldn't think twice about them. It was just a bit of change. That was all. My husband had been on his way to work, same as always, stepping out into the cold evening air with his uniform neatly pressed. He worked nights as a bouncer, standing outside some club, keeping the worst kind of people from getting in. I never liked it, but he was good at it. He was big, strong, the kind of man people didn't want to mess with. But under all that, he was quiet. He hated arguments. If someone started shouting at him, he'd rather just walk away. He wasn't one for trouble. That night, as he was leaving for work, there was a man outside the shop, standing near the old red phone box. This was years ago, back when people still carried coins for things like that. The man had been fumbling through his pockets, looking frustrated, and my husband, out of habit, out of kindness, handed him a bit of change and kept walking. Didn't think twice about it. If only he had. The next evening, the man was outside again. At first, I didn't even notice. I wasn't looking for him. My husband was halfway down the street when he saw him standing by the phone box, staring. Not at the phone this time. At him. He didn't say anything at first, just nodded, like he was acknowledging an old friend. My husband barely nodded back. He kept walking. The next night, the man was there again. And the next. And the next. Not always right at the phone box, but nearby. Sometimes leaning against a lamppost, sometimes pacing a little, sometimes just standing there, hands in his pockets, waiting. Waiting for what? We didn't know yet. My husband said nothing at first. He wasn't the kind to assume the worst in people. Maybe he just walks this way a lot, he said. Maybe he lives around here. But he didn't. Because one morning, when I went outside to take our toddler to nursery, I saw him. Standing across the road, staring at our house. I felt the chill before I even realized what was wrong. It wasn't just that he was there. It was the way he looked at me. I didn't know him, but his eyes locked onto me like I was someone he'd known forever. Like he'd been waiting for me. I scooped my toddler up and hurried to the car. I could hear my heart beating as I fumbled with the straps on the car seat. He didn't move. He didn't say anything. He just watched. That night, I told my husband. "It's just some weird bloke," he said, brushing it off. "He'll get bored." But he didn't. The next morning, he was there again. And the next. And the next. At first, he kept his distance. But then he got bolder. One morning, as I was strapping my toddler into the car seat, I heard footsteps. I turned my head, and there he was, walking toward me. I didn't breathe. He stopped at the curb, just a few feet away. I could see him clearly now, could take in every detail. He was thin, his clothes baggy and worn, but his face was smooth, almost childlike. His eyes were wide, and they didn't blink enough. I wanted to scream at him to go away, but I didn't. I just climbed into the driver's seat, locked the doors, and drove away as fast as I could. That night, my husband said nothing. I could see it in his face. He didn't want to talk about it. He didn't like confrontation. He wasn't the type to start trouble. So he did what he always did. He ignored it. The next time I saw him, he spoke. I didn't want to remember his voice, but I do. "You'd be better off without him," he said, standing just a few feet away as I loaded groceries into the car. "You should leave him." My blood turned to ice. He thought we were friends. He thought he knew me. I didn't look at him. I climbed into the car and drove away. That night, my husband was silent, but I could see it in his jaw, the way he clenched it, the way his hands curled into fists. He didn't want to fight, but he was running out of choices. The next morning, the doorbell rang. I froze. I wasn't expecting anyone. I crept to the window and peeked through the curtain. It was him, standing right there at our front door. I backed away, heart hammering in my chest. My toddler was in the living room, playing with his toys, oblivious. The doorbell rang again. Then he started knocking. Fist against wood, slow and steady. Knock, knock, knock. I grabbed my toddler and locked us in the bedroom. My hands were shaking as I reached for the phone. I called my husband first. Then I called the police. By the time they arrived, he was gone. They found him a few streets away. They talked to him. They warned him. They told him to leave me alone. It didn't work. That night, I heard something outside. I crept to the window. He was standing in the middle of the road, facing the house. Not moving, just watching. My hands shook as I called the police again. They came. They warned him again. But he kept coming back. The restraining order took time. Too much time. Every day, I was afraid to leave the house. Afraid to take my toddler to nursery. Afraid to go to the shops. Afraid to open the curtains. He was always there. Sometimes close. Sometimes just a shadow in the distance. But always watching. When the restraining order finally came through, I barely breathed. I wanted to believe it would be enough. It wasn't. He didn't stop until they arrested him. Even now, years later, I still think about it. I think about how it started. A handful of coins. That was all. One small act of kindness. And it turned into a nightmare. I don't talk to strangers anymore. I don't hold doors open. I don't stop to help. Because you never know. You never know who's watching. You never know who's going to latch onto you. And you never know when a stranger will decide that you belong to them. I had been on the job for 3 years when the call came in that night. It was late, just past 11 p.m., and I had been sitting at the station with my crew, waiting for the shift to pass in that slow, dull way that night shifts usually do. The dispatch crackled over the radio, sharp and urgent, cutting through the quiet. Structure fire, residential. Hemlock Street. Multiple occupants inside. The address was familiar. A 2-story home, an older build, nothing fancy. The kind of house that had probably been standing for 50 or 60 years, long before fire codes had tightened up. Older houses were always bad news. Dry wood, narrow hallways, poor ventilation. A fire could eat through them like they were made of paper. I was already moving before the call finished. Boots on, turnout gear up, strapped in the truck, lights flashing. The whole ride over, I was mentally running through procedures. What kind of house was it? How many people were inside? Where was the fire? What was our approach? We arrived fast, less than 5 minutes from the call. That's how it always was. It never felt fast enough. As soon as we pulled up, I knew it was bad. The fire had fully engulfed the back of the house, flames roaring up through the second floor. Smoke billowed into the night sky, thick and black, rising in columns. I could feel the heat from the truck. Even from the street, I could hear the fire. People always think fires are silent, like in movies. They're not. Fires are deafening, roaring, crackling, with splitting, glass shattering. The parents were already outside, screaming, choking on smoke, barely able to get words out. The mother collapsed on the grass, clutching at the father, both of them sobbing. The first kid was outside too, an older boy, maybe 10 or 11, crying and coughing. One kid was missing, a 6-year-old boy. I remember that exact moment because I felt my stomach drop. Kids in fires rarely make it. If they're not pulled out in the first few minutes, it usually doesn't end well. The thing about fires is that smoke kills long before flames ever do. We moved fast. The lieutenant barked orders. Hoses were unspooled. Water was blasted onto the house. The roof was already unstable, creaking under the pressure of the flames. I was on search and rescue. That meant going in. The front door was already wide open. That was a bad sign. Doors and windows being open meant the fire had a steady supply of oxygen. It was feeding the flames, making them stronger. I moved in fast, mask sealed tight, axe in hand, trying to find a way up the stairs. The heat hit me immediately. Inside, the air was thick with smoke. It burned my throat, even through the mask. Visibility was next to nothing. Just orange light flickering through the thick black. I could barely see my hand in front of me. We pushed through. The fire had already gutted most of the back of the house. The stairs were barely holding. I was behind my partner, watching every step, feeling the wood give slightly under my boots. If the floor collapsed, we'd be dead before anyone could reach us. We reached the hallway. The fire had completely blocked off most of it. The walls were charred black, flames eating their way through the ceiling. The kid's room was at the end of the hallway. We weren't getting through that way. The only other place he could be was the bathroom. I moved fast, checking doors. The bathroom door was shut. That was good. It meant the fire hadn't reached inside yet. If he was in there, he might still be alive. I forced the door open. The air inside was thick with smoke, but the fire hadn't made it inside yet. The bathtub was full. Water still running. The boy was in it. At first, I thought, God, he's alive. Then I got closer. His head was just barely above the waterline. His skin was wrong. It was red, peeling loose. I realized immediately what had happened. The poor kid had woken up, seen the fire, and run to the only safe place he could think of, the bathroom. He had turned on the water, maybe thinking it would protect him. He had climbed into the tub, trying to escape the flames. But the fire didn't get him. The smoke did. He had probably passed out within minutes, unconscious from the fumes. The fire had heated the pipes, sending boiling water into the tub. He had died there. The water was still scalding when we pulled him out. My partner reached for him first. His gloves slipped. I watched in horror as the skin on the boy's legs peeled away in sheets, sticking to my partner's gloves like wet paper. It was exactly like a boiled potato. I will never forget the way my partner recoiled. Not out of disgust, but out of sheer shock. You don't ever get used to seeing a dead child. You don't ever get used to feeling their body come apart in your hands. We carried him out as carefully as we could. But there was no saving him. Outside, the mother saw us carrying her son and let out a scream I can still hear in my head to this day. After that night, my partner took time off. He was never the same after that. I can't blame him. I wasn't either. That's the thing about firefighting. People think it's about running into burning buildings and saving people at the last second. Sometimes it is. But more often than not, it's about arriving just a few minutes too late. It's about carrying out bodies instead of saving them. It's about trying to sleep at night, knowing that no matter how fast you were, no matter how hard you tried, you weren't fast enough. It was a warm, clear afternoon when my mom and I decided to go out for lunch. Nothing unusual, just a quick trip to town, maybe a little shopping afterward. We had 2 dogs. Big, solid animals, not the kind you'd expect to vanish into thin air. The larger one was about 100 pounds, a pit bull mix with a broad chest and a strong stance. The smaller one, around 50 pounds, was more skittish, nervous about every little sound. Despite their differences, they were inseparable. Wherever one went, the other followed. Before we left, my mom reminded me to let them outside. They'd stay out while we were gone, run around, go to the bathroom, and by the time we got back, they'd be ready to come inside and nap. So I opened the door, let them out into the backyard, and shut it behind them. The yard was fully enclosed by a 6-foot privacy fence, solid wood, no gaps, no weak spots. There was a lock on the gate, always padlocked, no way for it to be opened unless you had a key. It was the kind of fence built to keep things in as much as to keep things out. I watched as the dogs ran out, sniffed around, and started trotting toward their usual spots. Then I locked the door behind me, grabbed my stuff, and left with my mom. It was a little over an hour later when we pulled back into the driveway. I stepped out of the car, expecting to hear the usual sounds, claws scraping against the back door, excited whines, maybe even a bark or two. Instead, there was nothing. Silence. I walked up to the house, unlocked the door, and stepped inside. No dogs. That was weird. They always came running when we got home. Maybe I forgot to let them out? It was possible. My memory wasn't perfect. I walked through the house, expecting to see them sprawled on their beds, waiting for us. But as I stepped into each room, I found nothing. Not on their beds. Not in the living room. Not in the kitchen. I started checking under things. Under the dining table, under the couch, under the bed in my room. I even checked the closet, even though the door had been shut the whole time. Nothing. Okay, maybe they were outside after all. Maybe they'd heard something interesting and were too distracted to come running. It wasn't like them, but it was possible. I went out into the backyard, scanning the area. The yard was big, with 2 sheds, plenty of trees, and an area we called the squirrel yard, a fenced-off section where we used to keep a pet squirrel. It wasn't the most organized yard. There were plenty of places to hide. I started searching. Checked behind the sheds. Checked inside the sheds. Walked along the trees, calling out in case they were laying low. Nothing. Now, the uneasy feeling started creeping in. If they weren't outside and they weren't inside, then where the hell were they? The fence was too tall for them to jump, and there were no open gates. That left only one possibility. I walked the entire perimeter of the yard, checking for holes. Sometimes they'd dig when they got bored, but we always patched up any weak spots before they got out of hand. Still, I checked carefully, running my hands along the base of the fence, looking for disturbed dirt, fresh gaps, anything. Nothing. Not even the smallest hole. Now, I was really getting uneasy. If they didn't dig their way out, and they didn't jump, then they didn't leave on their own. My mom and I met up by the back door. She had the same look on her face that I did. Something was wrong. The only explanation left was that someone had taken them. That thought made my stomach turn. Our bigger dog looked like a pit bull, which meant someone might have taken him for dog fighting. Maybe they took the smaller one as bait. It was a sickening thought, but it made more sense than anything else. Except how? The gate was still locked. Padlocked. No one had opened it. There weren't any signs of forced entry. No broken boards, no damaged latches, no cut locks. The only way in would have been to climb the 6-foot fence and somehow lift 2 struggling, heavy dogs over it. It didn't make sense. We checked the house next. Maybe, somehow, they had gotten inside. I didn't know how that could be possible, but nothing about this made sense, so why not? We checked the doors. Locked. We checked the windows. Locked. Even the ones that barely ever got used were still secured, with no signs of tampering. At this point, it was like they had never existed. I tried to think logically, tried to go over every possibility again, but every explanation fell apart under even the smallest bit of scrutiny. We had no choice but to start searching the neighborhood. We walked the streets, calling their names, checking corners, peeking through gaps in fences in case they somehow got into someone else's yard. Nothing. The longer we searched, the worse the feeling got. I kept going over it in my head. They were in the yard. I know I let them out. I know the doors were locked. I know there were no holes. I know there were no broken locks. I know no one could have taken them. So where are they? Another hour passed. At this point, I was preparing for the worst. Someone had to have taken them. Maybe someone had a key. Maybe they got into the house, grabbed the dogs, and locked everything back up. But that made no sense either. Nothing was missing. Nothing was touched. We decided to head back to the house and figure out the next step. When we got back, I went straight for the crawl space. Maybe somehow they had gotten under the house and were trapped. It was the only place I hadn't checked yet. I yanked off the grate and crawled in. Dirt and cobwebs brushed against my arms and face as I moved forward, shining my flashlight into the dark, cramped space. Nothing. No paw prints. No movement. No sound. I backed out, defeated. That's when I heard my mom shouting my name. I scrambled to my feet, my heart hammering. I ran inside. There, curled up in their beds, sound asleep, were the dogs. They were dry. They weren't panting. They weren't scared. They weren't acting like they had just been on an adventure. They were fine, like they had never been gone. We stood there, staring at them, the weight of the past 3 hours pressing down on us. The doors were still locked. The windows were still shut. There was still no way for them to have left. And yet they were here. Just here. I crouched next to them, running my hand through their fur. They didn't react any differently than they normally would. I looked at my mom. She looked at me. Neither of us had an answer. We never found one. Days passed, then weeks, then months, and we never figured it out. No one had keys to our house. The locks were never broken. No one had seen anything. To this day, I don't know what happened. But I do know one thing. For 3 hours, our dogs weren't just missing. They weren't anywhere. Wilderness survival campouts were supposed to be a challenge, but they were also supposed to be fun. At least, that's what I told myself as I hiked through the dense forest, leading a group of younger scouts toward our shelter site for the night. It was dark, much darker than we had anticipated. The trees closed in around us, their branches swaying in the wind, casting long, shifting shadows across the ground. Our headlamps cut narrow beams of light through the thick blackness, illuminating the dirt trail ahead. There were 10 of us, ranging from 11 to 16 years old, trudging single file up the path. The scoutmasters had stayed back at the main campsite, probably enjoying a fire, warm coffee, and the convenience of their store-bought tents. The rest of us, though, had spent the day building our own shelters, lean-tos made from branches, leaves, and whatever else we could find. The plan was to sleep in them overnight, testing our ability to survive with nothing but the materials the forest provided. It was supposed to be an adventure, but as the night set in, our little survival experiment felt less like fun and more like a test of nerves. I was 15, one of the older scouts, which meant I was responsible for keeping the younger kids in line. The role wasn't official, but it was understood. The little ones looked up to us, followed our lead. If we panicked, they panicked. So, even though I felt uneasy, I kept quiet about it. The trail was steep in places, winding up the side of a wooded hill. We were only about a mile from the main campsite, but with no adults and no direct supervision, the isolation was unsettling. We could barely see more than a few feet ahead at times, the thick forest making everything feel closer than it really was. The only sounds were the crunch of leaves under our boots and the occasional rustling in the trees. Probably just squirrels, maybe a raccoon. At least, that's what I told myself. We were about halfway to our shelters when we saw it. A large pickup truck, creeping slowly along a narrow dirt road that ran parallel to our trail. The headlights were off, but two massive floodlights on the top of the truck cast long beams through the trees, cutting through the night like searchlights. It was moving at a crawl, barely 5 miles per hour, as if the driver was looking for something. But what really made my stomach drop was the sound. Dogs. Not just barking, yelping. Dozens of them, all at once. The sound was frantic, desperate. Some of the dogs howled, others whined, and some let out short, sharp yelps that made my skin crawl. It wasn't just barking, they were in pain. Then came the voices. Deep, angry shouting from the truck, cutting through the dogs' cries. I couldn't make out the words at first, but I didn't have to. The tone was enough. Someone in that truck was furious, yelling over the barking, cursing. I caught bits and pieces. Shut the hell up. Goddamn mutts. Keep 'em quiet. The truck was only about 25 feet from us. Too close. Lights off, I hissed, and before I had even finished the sentence, the other older scouts had already switched off their headlamps. The younger kids followed, and within seconds, we were in total darkness. We froze, huddled together just off the trail. I could feel my pulse hammering in my throat. The truck kept creeping along the road, the floodlights swinging through the trees. I kept expecting them to land on us, for the driver to slam the brakes and step out. But the beams never quite reached our spot. The barking and yelling faded as the truck moved past us, but even after it was gone, none of us moved. We listened, barely breathing, until the only sounds left were the wind in the trees and the distant hoot of an owl. I swallowed hard. Let's keep moving. Nobody argued. We pressed on, keeping our lights off for as long as we could stand it. It wasn't safe to hike in total darkness, but we didn't want to risk drawing attention. The younger scouts were scared, though they tried not to show it. I was scared too. That truck hadn't just been transporting dogs. Those men had been angry, violent. The way they shouted, the way the dogs cried out, it wasn't hard to put the pieces together. This was something bad, and we had almost walked straight into it. We made it to our shelters, but no one was in the mood to talk. We sat in silence for a while, huddled around the dying embers of the fire we had left earlier. The younger kids kept glancing at the darkness around us, jumping at every snap of a twig. Even I had to force myself to sit still, to pretend I wasn't listening for the distant hum of an engine. Eventually, we agreed to go back to the main camp in the morning and tell the scoutmaster. There was no way we were staying another night out here, not after that. The forest was quiet for a long time. Then, sometime in the middle of the night, we heard them again. The dogs. Fainter now, farther away, but still desperate. And something else. A sharp, echoing crack. Gunshots. Nobody slept after that. At dawn, we wasted no time packing up. We left the lean-tos standing, gathered our gear, and started the hike back. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting pale light through the trees. It should have felt safer, but it didn't. When we reached the same road where we had seen the truck, we hesitated. There were tire tracks in the dirt, deep ones, like the truck had been parked here for a long time. I scanned the trees, heart hammering. No sign of anyone. No dogs. No sounds. We crossed quickly and kept going. But just before we reached the main campsite, one of the younger scouts grabbed my arm. His face was pale. "What?" I whispered. He pointed at the ground. Footprints. A lot of them. They weren't ours. These were bigger, heavier, and they hadn't been there last night. They led off the trail, deeper into the woods. I didn't say anything. I just turned and kept walking. We reached the main campsite in one piece, but we never talked about what we saw. We told the scoutmaster about the truck, the dogs, the gunshots. He listened, nodding, but he never said much. He just told us he'd report it to the park rangers. I don't know if he ever did. That night, as we lay in our tents, I kept listening. No dogs, no trucks, but the woods didn't feel empty. Even now, years later, I still think about that night. I still wonder what was out there. September 11th, 2001, started out like any other morning. I was still half asleep, barely aware of my mom moving around the house. The smell of coffee drifted through the air, mixing with the distant hum of the television, which my mom always turned on while she got ready for the day. I was awake, but not fully. My body was still wrapped in the heaviness of sleep, and I wasn't in a rush to shake it off. If I had known what was coming, I would have stayed in bed longer. I would have tried to freeze that moment when everything was still normal. I heard the low rumble of an airplane passing overhead. That wasn't unusual. We lived near an airport, and planes flew over all the time. One of them, I knew, was supposed to have my dad on it. He was flying out for work, something he did a lot. It had never been a big deal before. It was routine. He would leave, and a few days later, he'd be back. That was just how it was. I remember lying there, staring at the ceiling, listening to the usual sounds of the morning. Then the phone rang. Mom answered in the other room. Her voice was normal at first, but then it changed. The tone shifted. I couldn't hear what was being said, but something about the way she spoke made me uneasy. My stomach tightened in that way it does when you sense something is wrong before you even know what it is. A few moments later, she walked into my room. She looked pale, shaken, like she had just seen something terrible. "A plane hit the World Trade Center," she said. I remember blinking up at her, confused. A plane? That didn't make any sense. "What do you mean?" I asked, sitting up now. "They think it was an accident." That was all she said before turning and walking back to the TV. The news was on, and I followed her, standing a few feet away, watching the screen. The image of the North Tower of the World Trade Center, smoke pouring from it, filled the television. It didn't feel real. It looked like something from a movie, something staged. I was still trying to wrap my head around it when, on live television, another plane came into view. It was moving fast, too fast. Before my brain could even register what I was seeing, it slammed into the second tower. The impact sent a fireball into the sky. I remember the way my mom gasped. I remember the way my stomach clenched, so hard it felt like I was going to throw up. I remember how the reporters on TV went from shock to sheer panic. This wasn't an accident. Something was very, very wrong. And then, like a switch flipping in my brain, the realization hit me. My dad was supposed to be on one of those flights. My heart started pounding so hard it felt like it was rattling my ribs. I turned to my mom, but she was already reaching for the phone. She tried dialing my dad's number, but it didn't go through. She tried again. Nothing. She called the airline. The lines were jammed. Panic set in. It was thick in the air, pressing down on us. I don't remember everything I said. I just remember the feeling. The cold, creeping fear that crawled up my spine. The way my hands shook. The way my mom looked, her face tight, her eyes wide, her breathing uneven. She kept trying to call. I kept watching the TV. The towers were burning. People were running. Then, the news cut in. Another plane had hit the Pentagon. My knees went weak. Another one. This wasn't just happening in New York. This was everywhere. I don't know how long we sat there, watching. Time stopped making sense. The images on the screen blurred together. People covered in dust, firefighters running toward the flames, reporters struggling to keep their voices steady. Then the first tower collapsed. I will never forget the sound my mom made. It wasn't a scream, not really. It was something deeper, more broken. A sound of pure devastation. She was falling apart in front of me, and there was nothing I could do. I kept staring at the screen, trying to process what I had just seen. The tower was gone. Just gone. A massive cloud of smoke and dust spread through the city, swallowing everything. People were running for their lives. Some weren't running at all. I thought about my dad. I thought about the fact that he was supposed to be on one of those planes. Was that his plane? Was he in there? Had I just watched him die? The second tower fell. I lost it. I don't even remember if I said anything. I just remember the pure terror, the way my body felt like it wasn't even mine anymore. Mom kept calling. The phone lines were still down. I don't know how much time passed. Hours. It felt like days. We were just sitting there, stuck in this nightmare, unable to wake up. Then, sometime in the afternoon, the door opened. My dad walked in. For a second, I didn't move. I just stared at him, as if my brain couldn't believe what I was seeing, as if he wasn't real. Then, everything hit me at once. I ran to him. My mom ran to him. We were crying, shaking, holding on to him like if we let go, he might disappear. He was okay. He was okay. He was supposed to be on that plane, but a holdup at security had forced him onto the next flight. He hadn't called because it was too early, and he didn't think it mattered. He had spent the entire day trying to get back to us, not knowing what we were going through, not realizing that for hours we had thought he was dead. The relief was overwhelming. It crushed me. I had never felt anything like it before. But at the same time, I couldn't shake the weight of what had happened. Because while my dad had made it home, thousands of others didn't. Thousands of other families had watched those planes hit, had seen those towers fall, had waited by the phone, only to never get the call they so desperately wanted. We were lucky, but so many others weren't. The country changed that day. The world changed. I changed. I was young, but I wasn't a kid anymore after that. I had seen too much. And now, years later, I see people who don't even remember it. Kids who weren't even born yet. People who only know about 9/11 as something from a history book. I hope they never have to know what it really felt like. I hope they never have to live through anything like it. I wouldn't wish that on anyone. That day took so much from so many. And even though my dad came home, it took something from me too. I will never forget it. Not for as long as I live. Life was at a strange place back in 2010. I had graduated high school, started dating someone, and for a while things felt stable. I'd tried college, but it hadn't worked out, and I'd ended up dropping out. It wasn't something I liked to talk about. It felt like a failure, like something that loomed over me even when people weren't bringing it up. But I was getting by. I had friends. I had my family. Things weren't bad. One of those friends was someone I'd known for a while, someone I had trusted. I'll call him S. He lived down the road, younger than me but familiar, a friend of a friend in that tangled way small towns work. I spent a lot of time around him and his family, and his sisters too, both of them, even though they didn't know each other. I was comfortable around them. My parents even knew him. So when he asked me to go mud riding in his truck, nothing about it seemed strange. I should have known something was off when he told my parents I was helping him fix his computer instead. I didn't know that at the time. It was just another afternoon, and I didn't think twice about getting into his truck. We drove deep into the woods. I remember the trees passing, the way the sunlight started to fade behind the thick canopy. The air smelled damp, rich with the scent of mud and pine. The roads were rough, dirt and gravel kicking up behind the tires. I wasn't worried. I wasn't scared. I should have been. At some point, S propositioned me. I shut him down immediately. I was in a relationship, and even if I hadn't been, I wasn't interested. I told him no. I was firm about it. I don't remember exactly what he did or said next, but I know we kept driving. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't. We reached an old train bridge, a dark tunnel that felt like the middle of nowhere. The truck rumbled through it, tires echoing against the tunnel walls, and just as we came out the other side, it happened. The truck sputtered. The engine coughed. Then it died. Out of gas. We were 16 miles into the woods. No cell service. No houses. No roads I could walk that would lead anywhere safe before dark. I wasn't even wearing the right shoes for hiking through deep mud, and in a matter of minutes, they were gone, sucked into the wet earth like they'd never existed. I was barefoot, standing in the dirt, staring at S as reality set in. Panic curled in my stomach. S didn't seem as concerned. He got out, started gathering wood, built a fire. He told me to sit. The air was cooling fast, the sky darkening above the trees, and I had nothing. No food, no water, no way out. And then it happened. It's hard to describe what goes through your mind when someone you trust turns on you like that. It doesn't register at first, because it doesn't make sense. You tell yourself it isn't happening, that he'll stop, that there's some way to make it not real. But it was real. S held me down in the dirt. The fire crackled behind him, casting long shadows. The smell of smoke mixed with the damp earth beneath me. He was stronger. I fought, but it didn't matter. My voice didn't matter. My strength didn't matter. When it was over, I wasn't the same person anymore. I was bleeding badly. I was shaking. My mind felt like it was unraveling, spinning between rage, fear, and something else I couldn't even name. S acted like nothing had happened. I could barely stand, barely move. I sat by the fire, watching the flames, knowing I was stranded with him, knowing I couldn't run, that there was nowhere to run to. My body hurt, and I was still bleeding. The night dragged on, stretching into something endless, something unbearable. I didn't sleep. When the sun finally rose, S got up. He told me he was leaving to get help. I didn't believe him, but I didn't have a choice. I was too weak to walk 16 miles. I had no food, no water. If I stayed put, maybe someone would come. I was alone. Hours passed. The heat climbed. The air grew thick. I sat there, staring at the trees, listening to the empty silence around me, my body aching, my feet raw and burning every time I shifted. My stomach twisted with hunger. My lips cracked with thirst. The blood between my legs had dried, but I could still feel it, still smell it. The panic set in when I knew. He wasn't coming back. I had to move. I had to do something. I found an old soda bottle near the fire pit, something left behind by God knows who. I took it, stumbled to a nearby creek, and filled it with water. I drank without thinking, without caring. It was cold, and for a moment it was enough. Then I walked. My feet burned with every step. The ground was scorching, jagged shale baking under the sun, cutting into my skin, blistering me raw. I stumbled and fell, my palms scraping against stone, but I forced myself up, kept going. The old train tunnel was my goal. I needed to be closer to something, to anything. By the time I reached it, I collapsed. I screamed for help. The tunnel echoed back at me, swallowing my voice, stretching it into something distant and empty. And then, I thought I heard something. My name. I screamed again. Nothing. The sun kept sinking. My body kept failing. My mind was slipping into exhaustion, into something that felt like the edge of giving up. And then I saw them. Headlights. 10 cars. They came from nowhere, a parade of dust and noise and movement. And for a split second, I didn't believe it. I thought I was dreaming. I thought I was already dead, and this was just a hallucination, the last desperate sparks of a dying brain. Then someone touched me. I broke. I sobbed. They were real. I was rescued. I don't remember much after that, not in detail. I know there were EMTs. I know I was carried, put in a car, taken away from that place. I know I had second-degree burns on my feet, so severe I lost feeling for nearly 15 years. I was dehydrated, malnourished, lucky to have avoided infections or parasites. S had left me to die, and I would have if my family hadn't gone looking. The reason they went looking still haunts me. At 5 a.m. that morning, before anyone knew I was missing, before anyone knew I had no signal, my mom got a text. Help me. It had no sender. She showed it to my stepfather. They both read it. Then it disappeared. She called the cops. And somehow, someway, asterisk, they found me. Asterisk. I should be dead. I should have died in those woods, alone, broken, left to rot in the dirt. But I didn't. And S, he got away with it. The police barely did anything. He was free to live his life, to act like nothing had ever happened. I was left with the scars, the nightmares, the truth that no one wanted to hear. I learned something out there, something I'll never forget. Some monsters don't hide under your bed. Some of them drive you into the woods and leave you there to die. I don't think about that night often, But every now and then, something reminds me, maybe a news story, maybe the way the air feels on a cold December evening, and I get this sinking feeling in my chest. It's not just fear. It's that deep, stomach-turning realization of how close things came to being different, of how one small decision, something that seemed harmless in the moment, could have changed everything. Back in late December 2016, maybe 2017, I was working the evening shift at a grocery store in town. I'd had the job for years by then, and the routine was always the same. Customers came in, picked up their groceries, made small talk at the register, and left. Most days blurred together, especially around the holidays when people were rushing to stock up for Christmas and New Year's. That night was no different. It was cold outside, the kind of cold that makes your fingertips sting when you step out of the store. The automatic doors kept sliding open and closed as people came in, shaking off the chill before heading toward the aisles. The store smelled like a mix of bread from the bakery, fresh produce, and the faintest trace of pine from the Christmas decorations that still hung near the front. I'd been ringing people up for hours when he stepped into my line. I barely noticed him at first. He looked like any other customer, worn-out jacket, a little unshaven, nothing too unusual. He had a cart with a few items in it. Nothing big, just a couple of things you'd expect someone to pick up for a quiet night. A case of beer, some snacks, a frozen pizza. As I scanned his items, I did what I always did. I made small talk. Getting ready for New Year's? It was an automatic question, the kind you ask without really thinking. Just a way to fill the silence. Most people would respond with a casual, "Yeah, just staying in," or "going to a party." Something normal. But he hesitated, just for a second. Then he gave this kind of half smile and said, "I just moved here. Don't know anyone yet." I remember that exact moment so clearly because there was something about the way he said it. It wasn't desperate, wasn't even really sad, just empty. Like he was stating a fact, nothing more. I felt a small stab of sympathy. I knew what it was like to be new in town, to not know anyone, especially around the holidays. And for just a split second, I thought about inviting him to our family's New Year's party. Just a brief, passing thought. But I didn't. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was just hesitation. Maybe it was nothing more than the fact that I didn't really know this man, and it felt weird to invite a stranger into my home. Whatever the reason, I just smiled, handed him his receipt, and wished him a happy new year. He nodded, picked up his bag, and walked out. And that was it. At least, that's what I thought. New Year's came and went. Our party was small, just close family, the usual. We ate, drank, laughed, watched the countdown on TV, and when midnight hit, we clinked our glasses together and welcomed another year. It was nothing special, nothing out of the ordinary. Just another holiday. Then, on New Year's Day, we turned on the news. I wasn't really paying attention at first. The TV was on in the background, the way it always was. But then I heard something that made me stop. A family had been murdered. The details weren't fully clear yet, but the news anchor's voice was steady, almost too calm, as they went over what little they knew. A local family had invited a man, someone new in town, to join them for their New Year's celebration. Sometime during the night, something went horribly wrong. By morning, everyone in that house was dead, and then they showed his face. I can't even begin to describe what it felt like to see that mugshot pop up on the screen. It was him, the man from the grocery store, the man I'd almost invited to my house. I felt my stomach drop. I just stood there, frozen, my breath caught in my throat. It didn't feel real. It couldn't be real. But it was. The police didn't release all the details at first, but over the next few days, more information started coming out. He hadn't just killed them, he'd planned it. He'd picked them out, charmed his way into their home, and waited. He spent the evening with them, ate their food, drank their drinks, laughed at their jokes. Then, sometime after midnight, he turned on them. I kept thinking about what would have happened if I'd said something different at the register. If I'd invited him to our party. If he'd spent the night in our home instead of theirs. Would we have noticed something was off? Would we have realized, too late, that something wasn't right? Or would we have just been another story on the news the next morning? I tried not to think about it too much, but it was impossible not to. The store was different after that. I kept working, but I never looked at customers the same way again. Every time someone lingered too long, every time someone hesitated before answering a simple question, I felt that same instinctual wariness rise up in me. I never saw him again, obviously. He was arrested, charged, locked away. But even knowing that didn't change the fact that, for one brief moment, our lives had almost crossed paths in a way that would have ended everything. It wasn't just a close call. It was something more than that. Something darker. Because the scariest part wasn't that he was a murderer. The scariest part was that, until that moment, he hadn't seemed like one. I've spent years on the road, patrolling the vast stretches of Arizona highways, seeing just about everything a man can see in this job. Drunks crashing into ditches, drug runners who think they can outsmart the law, lost hikers wandering onto the shoulder desperate for help. But nothing sticks in my mind quite like the night we went looking for those two guys. It started like any other shift. The kind where the sun bakes the pavement all day, and by nightfall, the air still carries a ghost of the heat, radiating off the asphalt like a slow-burning fire. I was working highway patrol, pulling over speeders, checking plates, keeping an eye out for anything unusual. You get a gut feeling in this job when something's off, and when I spotted the old van rolling down the highway, something about it made my skin crawl. It wasn't speeding, it wasn't swerving, but I noticed how it moved, just a little too carefully, like the driver was hyper-aware of my presence. That's always a sign. Someone trying too hard to look normal usually isn't. I hit the lights, pulled up behind them, and signaled for them to stop. The van lurched slightly before slowing down, hugging the shoulder in a way that told me they'd been expecting this. I radioed in the stop, gave the plate number, and stepped out of my car. The highway was empty except for us. Nothing but black desert stretching out in every direction. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that makes the hair on your arms stand up. As I walked toward the driver's side, the van rocked suddenly. The side door flung open, and two men jumped out. No hesitation, no looking back, they just ran. Straight toward the barbed wire fence lining the side of the road, toward the open desert beyond. I barely had time to react. Most of the time, people freeze when they get pulled over. Sometimes they argue. Occasionally they try something stupid. But these two, they bolted like their lives depended on it. I reached for my radio, calling it in. Two runners, heading west into the desert, past mile marker 247. They were fast, but desperation makes a man faster. One of them, I'd later nickname him Beavis, cleared the fence in one go, rolling over the top like he'd done it 100 times before. The other guy, but head, wasn't as lucky. He got tangled up in the barbed wire, his clothes snagging, ripping. I could hear him grunt in pain before he finally broke free and disappeared into the darkness. I wasn't about to chase them on foot. The desert at night is no place for a man who doesn't know exactly where he's going. Holes, cacti, hidden drop-offs. One wrong step, and you're just another skeleton bleaching in the sun come morning. Backup arrived soon after. We searched the van. Nothing major, some fake IDs, a bit of cash, but nothing worth the kind of panic that made two men risk running blindly into the wild. We called in search teams. Dogs, helicopters, the works. It wasn't just about catching them anymore. Out there, without supplies, they weren't going to last long. The desert doesn't forgive mistakes. The first sign of Beavis came the next morning. One of the tracking dogs picked up his scent, leading the team into a dry, rocky wash a couple miles from the highway. I wasn't there when they found him, but I heard the details later. There are places in Arizona you don't want to fall into. This was one of them. Rattlesnake dens aren't common, but they exist. Beavis had found one the hard way. Maybe he stepped wrong. Maybe the ground gave way beneath him. However it happened, he went down into a pit swarming with them. The dogs wouldn't go near it. The men who found him said his body was barely recognizable, swollen beyond belief from the bites. How many got him? No one could say. A dozen? More? His face was contorted in a way that suggested he'd been alive for a while after the first bites, long enough to feel the venom working through him, paralyzing his muscles, shutting down his organs one by one. By the time we got there, the smell alone told us everything we needed to know. I remember standing at the edge of that pit, looking down at him. His arms were outstretched, fingers curled like he'd tried to claw his way back up. His eyes, or what was left of them, were open. The snakes had settled back into their den, coiled and still, like they hadn't just killed a man. We pulled him out, bagged him, and marked the site. That left Butthead. It took another day to find him. He'd made it farther, deeper into the desert. Probably had no idea where he was going, just running blind. Eventually, he must have spotted a small, abandoned shed near an old ranch site, and decided it was good enough for shelter. When we found him, he was alive. Barely. He was curled in the corner, his body twitching, his breath shallow. His skin was blotchy, turning shades no skin should ever turn. His eyes were swollen shut. We got closer and saw why. 3 black widow bites. I don't know if he got bit while sleeping, or if they were already in the shed when he crawled in. But it didn't matter. The venom had done its job. His pulse was erratic, and his breathing sounded like he had lungs full of broken glass. We loaded him up, got him to a hospital, and radioed in the situation. I rode in the back of the ambulance with him. He was drifting in and out of consciousness, his body fighting to shut down. Black widow venom isn't usually deadly to a grown man, but 3 bites? That's a different story. The ride back should have been uneventful. But Arizona wasn't done with us yet. We were barely 15 minutes down the road when the driver hit the brakes hard. The ambulance skidded to a stop, nearly sending me and Butthead tumbling. I looked up and saw them. 2 bulls. Massive. Broad-shouldered. Standing right in the middle of the road, staring us down like we'd wandered into their territory. And maybe we had. I've seen what a bull can do to a man. People like to joke about running from the cops, but you don't run from a bull. You don't challenge it. You don't move fast, don't make sudden noises, don't do anything that might piss it off. The driver and I locked eyes. Slowly, he reached for the gear shift, easing the ambulance into reverse. I watched the bulls, waiting for a sign, any sign, that they were about to charge. Their nostrils flared. Their hooves scraped against the pavement. But they didn't move. We inched backward until we were out of their line of sight. When we finally turned onto another road, I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding. By the time we reached the hospital, Butthead was still alive. I don't know what happened to him after that. Maybe he recovered. Maybe he didn't. Either way, his running days were over. Some men run from the law and make it. Some don't. And some get a different kind of justice. Arizona has a way of taking care of its own. I've never been able to explain what happened that night. I don't even like thinking about it too much because it just makes me feel like I'm losing my mind. Every time I try to work through the details, none of it adds up. But I know it happened. I know what I heard, what I felt. And no matter how many times I replay it, I can't come up with an explanation that makes sense. I live in a pretty isolated area. It's not completely in the middle of nowhere, but the nearest house is about a quarter-mile away. There's a walking path that runs right in front of my house, and it's popular with people in the area, hikers, joggers, dog walkers. You get used to seeing strangers passing by during the day, but at night, it's different. The woods swallow up sound. The trees make everything feel closer than it is. And when it's dark, you're reminded just how alone you really are. That night, I was in my room on the 2nd floor, doing homework. My attic is right above me, and my desk is set up near the window, so I can see out into the woods if I turn my head. It was getting late, and the sky had that deep navy color that comes right before full darkness. The kind where the trees start blending together into a solid black wall. I remember shifting in my chair and stretching, rubbing my eyes after staring at my laptop screen for too long. My house was quiet. Too quiet, actually. You know that kind of silence that feels heavy? Where you suddenly become very aware of every little sound. The ticking of a clock, the faint hum of electricity, the creaks in the walls that only seem to happen when you're paying attention. It was like that. Then I heard it. Gunshots. Right above me. Not distant, not muffled. Asterisk, asterisk, right above my head, asterisk, asterisk. The sound was sharp, deafening, like someone had fired a gun inside the attic. My entire body locked up. I didn't even have time to think. It was pure instinct. My stomach clenched, my breath caught in my throat, and before I even realized I was moving, I was out of my chair. I don't know how to describe the way it felt in that moment. It wasn't just fear, it was wrong. Everything in me was screaming that I shouldn't be there, that I needed to move, get out. But I was frozen, staring at my ceiling like I expected it to burst open. Then came the second noise. A thud, something heavy dropping onto the attic floor. I felt my skin go cold. Someone was up there. Someone had fired a gun in my attic. I grabbed my phone and bolted for the stairs, but I barely made it to the first step when I heard the TV turn on upstairs. Not the one in my room, the old one in the hallway, the one nobody uses. The volume was up high, the voices loud and distorted. And then a door slammed. I don't remember making the decision to run. My body just moved. I was out the door and down the front steps before I even had my phone in my hand properly. I didn't stop. My legs were moving faster than they ever had in my life, tearing down the path toward my friend's house way down the street. I don't even remember looking back. I just ran. By the time I got to their house, I was shaking so hard I could barely talk. They let me in, confused, asking me what the hell was going on, but I couldn't get the words out at first. I just stood there, catching my breath, my heart slamming in my chest. I must have looked insane. I told them everything. The gunshots, the thud, the TV, the slamming door. I kept expecting them to laugh or say I was overreacting, but they didn't. They just stared at me, eyes wide, nodding slowly. I could tell they believed me, or at least they believed something had happened. I didn't go back home until my dad got back with our dog 2 hours later. The whole walk back, I kept expecting to see something. A broken window, a sign of forced entry, some clue that I hadn't lost my mind. But there was nothing. The house was just as I had left it. The front door was locked. The windows were shut. My dad and I went through the whole house together, checking every room. When we finally pulled down the attic ladder, my hands were sweating so much I could barely get a grip on it. We climbed up, my dad leading with a flashlight. My heart was hammering in my ears. I kept expecting to see something, bullet holes, shell casings, some sign that a gun had been fired up there. But there was nothing. No damage, no disturbance. The attic looked completely untouched. I felt sick. We checked the TV in the hallway, too. It was off, just like I had left it. There was no sign that it had even been turned on recently. My dad tried to reassure me, saying maybe I had heard something from outside, and it just sounded like it came from the attic. Maybe a tree branch had fallen. Maybe the TV had some kind of power surge. But I know what I heard. I know the difference between a distant noise and something happening right above my head. I know the weight of a real gunshot. I know the sound of a door slamming in an empty house. No one ever figured out what happened that night. No one else in the area reported hearing gunshots. No strange footprints, no signs of a break-in. Nothing. And that's what makes it worse. If there had been something, anything, to explain it, maybe I could move on. But there wasn't. Just silence. And every night since, when I'm lying in bed, staring at my ceiling, I wonder, what would have happened if I had stayed? Camping had always been something families did together, a way to escape the routines of home, let kids run free, and spend nights under the stars. It was normal, something that felt safe, something that felt like a break from the rest of the world. But for one family, a single night changed that forever. The storm had been relentless. For hours, rain pounded the ground, heavy and unyielding, a constant drumming against the tent fabric and the soaked earth. The wind howled in from the ocean, bending the trees on the ridge above and sending thick sheets of water sweeping across the campsite. The air was thick with the scent of wet soil, salt, and the damp, clinging cold of a storm that refused to pass. It had started early in the afternoon, an expected rain that quickly grew into something worse. No gaps between the downpours, no light mist or gentle sprinkling, just solid, hammering sheets of water, hour after hour. The ground became a sponge, the dirt turning to sludge beneath every step. Most of the campers huddled in their tents or under tarps, trying to stay dry. Some had retreated to their cars, letting the rain hammer against the metal as they sat inside, listening to it drum against the roof. Others made the best of it, gathering under makeshift shelters, joking about how much worse it could get. No one knew how bad it actually would get. The family, mother, father, their young daughter, and their newborn son, were tucked into their tent at the lowest point of the campsite, closest to the slope. It hadn't seemed dangerous at first. The beach was nearby, the ocean stretching out into the darkness beyond the rain, waves rolling and crashing endlessly. The hill behind them was steep, but it had always been there, covered in thick vegetation and dirt that had held firm for years. But the rain was different this time. It wasn't just soaking into the ground, it was changing it. The night dragged on. Inside the tent, the air was damp, thick with the scent of wet fabric and muddy clothes. Water had seeped through the seams, soaking the floor, turning sleeping bags cold and clammy. The baby was bundled up as best as possible, his tiny body wrapped in layers to keep him warm against the chill. His sister lay beside him, curled under a damp blanket, the sound of rain drowning out everything else. The parents barely slept. They could feel the weight of the storm outside, the way the wind shook the tent, the way the ground felt softer beneath them than it should have. The worry sat in the back of their minds, unspoken but there, pressing down heavier with every passing hour. Then, at around 4 a.m., it happened. It started as a deep, heavy groan, barely audible over the storm. Then the earth moved. It wasn't an explosion, not a sudden burst of motion, but a slow, dragging shift, a deep, grinding noise as the hillside gave way. Then came the rush. A wall of mud, heavy with water and debris, surged down the slope. Trees bent and snapped, their roots no longer able to hold them in place. The thick, soupy mix of dirt and rocks moved fast, faster than anything should move, swallowing everything in its path. It hit the tent first. The fabric shredded instantly, collapsing in on itself as the weight of the mud forced it down. Poles snapped. Stakes ripped free from the ground. The entire structure crumpled, the rain-soaked fabric pressing down under the suffocating weight of the landslide. Inside, there was no warning, no time to react. One moment, they were lying there, listening to the storm. The next, they were buried. The mother felt it first, the sudden, crushing weight pressing down on her chest, the cold shock of wet earth forcing its way into the tent. She gasped, but her breath caught in her throat. Mud filled her mouth, thick and heavy. She twisted, panicked, clawing at the shifting earth around her. She couldn't see. The darkness was absolute. She could hear her husband struggling somewhere nearby, the sound of fabric tearing, of bodies shifting under the sudden weight of the landslide. Then the baby. His cries were muffled, choked, barely audible under the thick layer of mud. The mother's panic turned to terror. Her hands scrambled, desperate, digging blindly through the dirt. She could feel something, soft, small, unmoving. The baby. He was completely covered. She dug frantically, her fingers sinking into the thick, heavy mud, pulling, until finally she felt his tiny body. She grabbed him, yanking him free, feeling the wet, cold weight of him against her chest. He wasn't breathing. Her own breath came in ragged gasps, her hands slick with mud as she wiped at his face, clearing the dirt from his nose, his mouth. Please, please. Then finally a sound. A tiny choked breath. A weak, gasping cry. Relief slammed into her so hard she nearly collapsed. But there was no time. She twisted, trying to find her daughter. The little girl was trapped under the collapsed tent, her body half buried in the mud. She was crying, her small hands struggling against the weight pressing down on her. Her father was already pulling at the remains of the tent, his voice hoarse, his movements wild with desperation. Together, they dragged their daughter free, pulling her from the thick sludge, her face streaked with dirt and tears. They couldn't stop. They had to get out. The mud had swallowed everything. The tent was destroyed, the ground unrecognizable, a churned-up mass of wet earth and broken branches. The rain was still falling, the wind still howling, but none of it mattered anymore. Other campers had woken to the noise, the deep, terrifying roar of the landslide. Flashlights flickered through the darkness, voices calling out in confusion and panic. By the time people reached them, the family was standing there, covered in mud, shaking, the baby clutched tightly in his mother's arms. No one knew what to say. There was nothing to say. The realization of how close it had been hung in the air, thick and heavy. If the tent had been just a few feet closer to the slope, if the mud had come down any faster, if they hadn't woken up in time, they would have been buried alive. The sun rose slowly over a changed landscape. The campsite was a mess, the ground torn apart, the hillside scarred where the mud had given way. The air was thick with the smell of wet earth and broken vegetation, the echoes of the storm still lingering in the gray morning light. The family didn't stay to pack. They left that morning, shaking, exhausted, their minds still trapped in the suffocating darkness of those few, terrifying minutes. They never went camping again. No one blamed them. Because sometimes the wilderness doesn't just remind you of its power, it forces you to understand it. I never thought I'd end up knowing people like them. Maybe that sounds naive, but back in high school, they were just guys. We all knew each other, some better than others, but we moved in the same circles. Parties in the woods, cheap beer, occasional fights that ended with someone spitting blood into the dirt. The usual small-town stuff. But looking back, I should have seen it, and was always a drifter. He dropped out in 9th grade, and never really belonged anywhere after that. Lived in different places, did odd jobs, spent most of his time hanging around the kind of people you don't bring home to your mother. E, on the other hand, was different. He was my best friend in high school. One of those guys who could fit in anywhere, always had a plan, always had an angle. If there was trouble, he knew how to find a way out of it. And then there was Jay. Jay was a guy who thought he was untouchable. Maybe he was for a while. He had connections, and for a time, those connections kept him moving up. But he was reckless. He thought because he was dealing for the Native Americans up north, he was safe. When they told him to run a job, he ran it. No questions, no hesitation. But when he got caught with that shipment, when the cops pulled him over and found his stash, everything changed. 6 months in jail wasn't even the real punishment. That came after. By the time Jay got out, he was already a dead man walking. The people he worked for weren't the forgiving type. He owed them money, and if you owed them money, you had two options: pay up or disappear. Jay had neither the cash nor the sense to disappear. That's where N and E came in. I don't know exactly how the idea formed. Maybe it started as a joke, or maybe they convinced themselves they were doing Jay a favor. Maybe N just wanted to be the one calling the shots for once. Whatever the reason, they made a plan: bring Jay back to the reservation, hand him over. Maybe they thought they could take his place, start dealing themselves. Maybe they thought they'd walk away with some kind of respect. Whatever the plan was, it didn't matter. Because once they started, there was no turning back. Jay had no idea what was coming. They invited him over to E's place, just a regular night. Maybe a few drinks, maybe talk about old times. He didn't see it coming when he stepped out from behind the bushes with a rock in his hand. The hit should have killed him. Maybe they thought it had. But Jay was tough. They tied him up while he was still unconscious, stuffed him into the trunk of his own car, and started driving. The road stretched long and dark, nothing but headlights cutting through the night. They were heading for New York, to the reservation, but they never made it that far. Somewhere along the way, Jay woke up. Imagine that moment. Waking up in the dark, your arms pinned behind your back, the smell of your own sweat mixing with the scent of gasoline and old metal. You don't know where you are at first. Then you remember E's house, the blow to the head, the feeling of the ground coming up fast. You realize you're in the trunk of your own car. Jay did what anyone would do. He started kicking. He started screaming, and pulled over at a rest stop, probably hoping to shut him up before someone noticed. Jay knew what was happening now. He played along, said he just needed to take a piss, swore he wouldn't run. Of course he ran. He must have known he wouldn't get far. They chased him through the dark, his breath sharp and ragged in the cold air. Maybe he thought he had a chance. Maybe he thought if he made it to the road, if he found someone, he could survive this. But N had a gun. One shot. Jay went down. They dragged his body to a creek, left him there like a piece of trash. They took his wallet, the rope, his clothes, dumped them in Rochester like they meant nothing. Then they torched his car in Chicopee, watching the flames eat away the evidence. The next part is what gets me the most. Because they didn't just go into hiding. They didn't run. They didn't act guilty. He just kind of faded. People saw him less, and when they did, he looked different. Maybe it was paranoia, or maybe it was something else, something deeper, something eating away at him. And though, N kept moving. And then the trial came. And suddenly, the story changed. According to N, he wasn't really involved. He only hit Jay, only helped put him in the trunk. The rest? That was all N. Maybe that was true. Maybe it wasn't. But in the end, he was gone. Just gone. No one really knows where he went. Some people think he skipped town, started fresh somewhere else. Others think he didn't get that chance. Me, I think if you spend enough time wading through the filth, eventually, it pulls you under. And no one comes looking for you when you're already gone.